Okay, we are now live on World Beyond War's YouTube channel, and we are recording this webinar, so if you have to leave at any time, don't worry, we will send the link to the recording afterwards. We're going to get started now. My name is Greta Zaro, and I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War, and I'm so excited to welcome you to day 2 of our No War 2020 virtual conference. This conference had been planned for Ottawa, Canada this week, and due to the coronavirus pandemic, everything has been switched to a virtual event. And so this is day 2. And we will have 2 back-to-back panel presentations today from 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The first presentation, starting now, will be talking about how to shut down a weapons expo. And we'll be hearing from activists and organizers from around the world who have experience in their communities working to protest and shut down weapons expos. So we'll hear from 4 speakers, each in turn, and then after that, we will open up to Q&A and discussion. So the first speaker that I will introduce is Ao Pritchard. Ao is an Indigenous rights activist, Two-Spirit movement capacity building facilitator and trainer, community engagement specialist, and practitioner consultant. Ao is a co-founder of Pacific Panthers, connecting with Pacific Synergies, utilizing Indigenous knowledge and practices to strengthen communities in resistance against colonization. Ao is a founding member of Auckland Peace Action in New Zealand and a lifelong community organizer. Ao designed specific Indigenous responses to New Zealand's 2016 Weapons Expo, as well as working with the wider peace action groups across the country to train people in nonviolent direct action and media messaging, responding to the 2016 through 2018 Weapons Expos in New Zealand. And without further ado, welcome Ao.
Kia ora everyone. Nice to join everyone this evening or this morning if you're in Aotearoa. Should I just share my screen now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here we go. Yes, kia ora everyone. He mihi kia koutou. It's nice to be joining everyone speaking about shutting down the arms trade or the arms expo. I'll start with what's happened in Aotearoa and just present the slideshow for you. We'll start now.
We are going to shut this thing down for good. We don't want the arms trade in Aotearoa. Full stop. Most of you are not just on this kaupapa. You're not just out here marching for peace. You're out here marching for climate justice. You're out here marching for the future of the world.
We don't want a world where people get killed for money. That's what we're about.
So in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we have we've been working with the against the arms trade for 21 years. The peace groups have been working together for the last 21 years, and specifically in the last 4 to 5 years, I have been involved in the actions, and we've seen an accumulated development between strategies and collective organising. And in the last 5 years in Wellington, then it moved to Auckland and back to Wellington, and our final one in Palmerston North, we were able to shut down the arms trade, and it's been very exciting. The focus and also a lot of work has gone into gathering and working collectively. So one of the main tips that we've used in been able to work quite strongly together, it's the relationships. And so in Aotearoa, the Indigenous people, the First Nations, what we use is a relationship model where we connect to each other. We find ways that we can have common connections. We get to know each other. We ensure that we're present and we are part of the relationships that we are connecting to. And so in a First Nations perspective for Māori and Aotearoa, that relationship is the foundation of what future work you might do together, how you may come together, the encounters you have, and also bringing together the diverseness of people. And so that has been the main thing that we've been working on, is how to engage and how to work together from different cultures, different ethnicities, with different language perspectives and different values and beliefs. And we've been working on those relationships because although we all are striving to achieve peace in our country or the nation or the world, we realise that we are very diverse and we have different ways to understand, different ways to practice, different views on how we want to achieve different goals. And so relationship has been the focus of our development, specifically in the last 5 years that I've been a part of it, and I'm sure previously as well. And the other reason we work together on our relationships is because when we're standing side by side, the person next to us is the person who we'll trust in, the person who will need to watch our back on actions and blockades. And so we need to get to know them as much as we can. So we do some fast tracking relationship building when we come together for actions and training. However, in the years that we've been working together, it's about developing those relationships, not just in the actions, not just when we come together, but also between those periods, so that we can have a genuine relationship. For First Nations, it's really important if you're developing relationships in any country that the First Nations people, you develop relationships with them. So I am a First Nations person, and it's become an important part of any work that we do in Aotearoa, because the First Nations people have acknowledgement here, and those people that we have allyships with or we work with, we bond that relationship with ourselves, so they get to know us, they get to know our history, so that we can work together. And when we endeavour to achieve a goal, part of that commitment is to ensure that we're always empowering, we're always uplifting, we're always acknowledging the First Nations. And when we are achieving a national objective, it's not at the cost or at the detriment of the First Nations. So we give quite a lot of consideration and time to develop those relationships, especially when we're doing any actions in our territories, because the First Nations people, they are connected to that land, and even though they don't own that land in some places, the focus is to ensure that we acknowledge them, we work with them, and we ensure that whatever work we do in those territories or those lands does not conflict or go against the building of these people, First Nations. So we support the communities to take control of the determinants of their own health. And so in this situation, when we did an action in Auckland, at the same time as the arms trade expo, the Navy or the Defence had a celebration, and so they called their operations Mahi Tangaroa, and that for the First Nations people is the name of one of their gods, their atua. And so what occurred is that our group, Pacific Panthers, we created a First Nations response, a ceremony, so that we could use our own cultural practices, our own language, bring together other First Nations so that we could share spiritually and speak to our gods, which Tangaroa is the ocean, and claim back that name that the Navy was using to name their own actions. And part of that was, they're using our names to basically destroy the oceans or in other countries' lands. And so we knew that we had to make that stand and make that claim. So we worked with the other peace action groups to support all the actions that we wanted to put together, created a week long of peace actions, and then we dedicated one day to this. And in the ceremony, we had the spaces where we could deliver our ceremonies. We could do that with only First Nations people, and all our allies, our non-First Nations people, supported us by standing back and not getting involved, so that that spiritual space was protected and sacred. So that's important about relationships. The other part of relationships is community relationships. So the tip around relationships for us is, when you are doing any action, it's important to know your community. We have found that sometimes when we do, in the past, when actions have happened, those people doing the actions have left that community and not connected. And so you only come together when there's an action, but actually the community is existing every day. And so if you want to build a genuine relationship, part of that is to get involved in the community, because when you want the community to support you in ensuring that we have peace and that people are cared for, then we have to turn up to their events when they are asking similar things of ourselves. So in the community relationship, it's about building real relationships, real support, real allies. And this helps us because we also learn how to work with various dynamics and diverse peoples. And those diverse peoples will actually be able to contribute different things to our actions, so that we can reach bigger or wider audiences. It also is a commitment to your own community, that we're not wandering outside of our community and ignoring our own. So that's the focus that's been really working for us, is building our own community relationships. And on this page, you can see all the groups that have been participating with us that are committed. So we have relationships with all these groups. Various people have those relationships, and we stay connected. And when they reach out to us for support, then we find ways to see how we can support them. And so that reciprocation occurs. And so we keep building the energy and momentum, and we keep building the number of people that get involved, because it's also about a commitment to the relationship that people will turn up. So as you can see, there's a variety of different groups from different areas. It's not just activists. So part of our work that has been successful was getting community members involved in what's happening in the community and how it's affecting them. They are not excluded because they're not activists. They're not excluded because they have some faith-based. We find the common thread, which is the peace thread, so that we ensure that we're all working towards peace. And to work against military arms in the sales of that. The other thing with the communities that we did is that we went out to communities. So we've had groups that have travelled around our country, and then, as you see here, we've advertised and we've gone to other towns, or other cities, and we've connected with those groups through someone that we've known from that town, or we've connected with someone who is inviting us, and we went to those towns and we shared our knowledge and we shared our training. And one of the things in this particular event is that we traveled around to develop momentum and connect with people so that they would come to a town that was far away from their own, like in Wellington. And what we did there is that we didn't just go and talk, we realised that to move the community to connect with our action in Wellington, we took some screen printers, we did some art workshops, we got the community to come together, or they brought themselves together, and what we did was we supported them to think about what was the message that their community wanted to present at this action. So at the Arms Trade Expo, what message did that community want to bring? What message did that collective group from their position or their ethos want to bring to our action? So we had a variety of messages from different parts of the community, but we all came together because we agreed that we wanted to create peace without arms. So that was a common goal, but the specific messages people had developed their own. So they did some bonding in their groups, they connected with each other, they got some buddy systems happening before the event even happened. And then when they turned up to the event, they had these t-shirts that they created and they wore. So they had the sense of unity when they arrived at the action, and they had the sense of belonging when they arrived at the action months before it actually happened. We also did some NVDA training, and one of the things that we identified with that was to do a non-violent continuum, where I think most people will know this, but it's where you have one end is what is violence and what is non-violence, so that people can see and identify where they stand on that and how they define that and what it looks like to them and to others. And the main thing that we kept doing that and really focusing a lot of time on that is because we discovered that people have different ideas of what is violent and what is non-violent. However, we were able to get to a point where even if someone thought that breaking a window was violent and another person thought it was not violent, those specific things didn't stop them from agreeing that we shouldn't be selling arms, we shouldn't be having an expo that sells arms, and we should be working towards peace. So if participants came to our action, it was really clear that if you had a complete, quite a different perspective on what violence and non-violent look like, or define that in the action of the blockade, one of the actions we did was a blockade, that you're not stand together in the blockade. Because if you stood together in the blockade and you had a philosophical difference on specific details, then you might get caught up in that discussion and try to convince each other to be swayed by the other, and then the focus won't be about the blockade. The focus won't be standing there and ensuring that the arms traders do not get into the conference. It'll actually be a distraction. So we talked a lot about that and encouraged people to be really clear and genuine about what their personal positions were, and not try to convince someone to move along that continuum, but be okay with yourself and take care of yourself, knowing that you have a different perspective than the person that's in the training, and come on the day of the blockade, try not to stay together, especially if you're in the front line. Those are not the times to have deep conversations or try to have arguments around who is correct. So that's some work we did there. One of the other second tips is, we talked a lot about not being afraid to win, and to think about what we would do when we win, especially after events, after the blockade particularly, or we did a peace march, and we did some other activities, we realized that at the end of it, we ended, it's like, how do we know we're successful? And we talked a lot about what success looked like for us. And we talked a lot about the different ways that we can be successful. People had views that if we did not shut down the Arms Expo, and it didn't leave the country straight away, we'd fail. So we realized that we need to identify the steps of success. And there are many different ways that we are winning. And to plan for our win. So in Auckland, all our events, actually, we decided to plan for an end celebration. Also, we want to acknowledge that everyone's contribution was a winner. Everyone coming together on the day, we were winning that way. People staying the whole day, people bringing us food, people organising. There is so much that we were winning on. It was really about developing the bond, the build, and the connection. And on most of our events, like this one here, we managed to block a whole day, do a blockade of a conference for an entire day. And people stayed the entire day and kept their energies up. So those are really important moments as well, not just the stopping the traders from getting into the conference or being exhausted or watching the police. It was about ensuring that we released all that tension at that venue and we danced it off, and that became our signature after every action, to have a dance off. And it really helped to release and celebrate, and for people to go home with some really positive, exciting energy, and for us to cheer each other on rather than just disperse and then be really exhausted and injured sometimes. The third tip is do some research and put some background information together. One of our groups put together a report, and it identified all the participants involved in the Weapons Expo, those who were attempting to sell arms, or those who are wanting to access research funding or funding. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that people were standing in front with a hashtag, war starts here. So we went for a walk to all the places in that location, in that area that we had the blockade and the protest, and we took that hashtag and we made it well known that these people, these companies that do, people usually don't identify them. These are the companies that actually contributing to the war and making money from it. So we went on a little walk around the town and then took a drive. So it's really helpful for people to have the information. Those who didn't come to the action for that year, they had information to read. And also the media was able to just pick up the names and name them in any media reports that went out. The fourth tip is to be clear about tactics that you want to use, and to get the training and gears to the people. So one of the things is that for our blockades, we wanted to make sure that we had the gears, and that the people who wanted to do blockades or do any other action, they had the resources, and we got it to them if they couldn't pick it up, because ideas are great, but when you don't have resources, it doesn't come to fruition, and then we don't actually, we aren't able to achieve the various actions or activities that we want. The other thing around non-violent direct action, many people do it. So we had regular training, free training, that was spoken about some ideas just the other day. And we also wanted people to know that when we have actions, that anyone can turn up and do a blockade. Anyone can turn up and stop participants or arms traders from entering conferences. And so we wanted to demystify the fact that you needed special skills and you need to be a well-trained activist to enable yourself to do this. It's like every person off the street, we were able to give them some skills at different levels so they could participate. And that way they felt included. And those who didn't want to be on the front line, like we have done, we've allocated tasks, food tasks, care tasks. So just identifying spaces where people can actually contribute with their limitations or their fears, and working them through those fears so that they feel safe to be a part of it. Even if they're standing off cheering and holding signs, that is quite an important role as well. The fifth tip is safer spaces. So we created a safer spaces policy just to outline it just outlines the priorities for participating in actions. This was really important for us so that we could take care of ourselves when we're in an action. So often we think it's either just the police or the people we're trying to block from entering a conference, or the arms trade that could hurt us. But sometimes in actions, it's the people that are participating in the blockade or the protest that inadvertently hurt us and don't think about it. So we created that. It's helped us to talk to everyone and make sure that everyone is safe. So they've got some guidelines because safety is really important for us. A group also wrote an emotional first aid care and safety document, so that when you lead the actions, and we realize that when you leave all the energy, you leave the support group, and so you can't leave alone. And when you get home, just to have that available should the effects of the day come to you, and then you have no one else to talk to. So it has a checklist on getting buddies before you go home, making sure you've got someone to talk to. If you become low or feel sad because of the day, then there's techniques or contacts that you can reach out to. The sixth tip is to be clear and focused, to be clear about what you actually want to achieve, and also to be focused, to be clear about what you want to achieve. So in the actions, we decided not to worry about how the media would represent us, because sometimes in previous actions, there's been debates about how the media will portray us. And rather than spend lots of energy trying to work against that, we just focused on, on the activities we were going to participate in to make sure we achieved our objective, which was to do some financial damage towards the companies that were participating in the arms trade. And that helped, really does help to have some background information to support that. The other tip is we use humor in our videos, so that people who just need some laughter, laughter is really important for us. These actions and what we're doing is always intense, and it's quite draining. Sometimes we need to have humor, just to just to laugh and release some of that tension and energy. I'll just show a little clip of a little bit of this clip.
$1 billion cybersecurity budget up for grabs. Making profit from the sweet, explosive justice. Invest in New Zealand security. That means buy weapons.
So laughter sometimes for some people. Some of us are quite intense and we can be quite focused, and other people need to release and have a good laugh and make fun of the arms trade as well. So those are the tips, and then we were asked to identify some challenges. And one of the challenges that we know, the groups we've been working with, some people have found it a challenge to ensure that First Nations have absolute sovereignty or are self-determining. And so we come from a country where First Nations, we work quite consciously to ensure that First Nations are given the space and opportunity and support to determine how they want to achieve wellness, how they want to ensure that their lands, their treasures are not destroyed, and that the people are well and taken care of. And so it's all about identifying their culture and supporting them to practice that way. So when we did the Karanga Tangaroa action around the Navy naming the operations Tangaroa, First Nations and other Pacific Island groups, we all dressed very blatantly from our cultural attire. It was very obvious that we were from First Nations or Indigenous nations. And so that was a challenge for some people in the public and some groups who couldn't participate in our rituals. And so they had to work through how to support us by not actually actively joining us in our rituals, but supporting us from the aside and doing other things so that we could have the space to just be in our own spirit, in our own collective spiritual bond there. So that can be a challenge, and we've met people who have challenged by that. The other challenge associated with that is learning about colonisation and how that has impacted on the First Nations people, and as a non-First Nations having to deal with that. So some people are new to that, and so when we get together, there's some work that has to be done. Some of the other challenges around relationships, of course, is working with organisations that are answerable to stakeholders. So we have had situations where we've created actions and then organisations have to check their stakeholders, and their stakeholders actually determine if they can participate or go ahead and join us with different parts of the action. So that's for them to decide, but the difficulty is working with that when it's not, you're not upfront with that. So being clear and being upfront and being quite truthful to each other helps the groups to connect better. Working with organisations or action participants on the day, that has been a challenge, and we've worked out quick, training sessions on the day, or at the same time we've asked people to move in groups or just take care of people who turn up and don't have training. So we just have to be mindful of that as well. Adjusting expectations for communities. So when we work across communities, like in Palmerston North, we went to Palmerston North, and so we had to work with that community, and that community had a certain style about themselves. So we had to learn about that community, learn how we can contribute to the strategy the community needed to do. So in that community, there were a lot of church involved, and so we had to work, who didn't want to do blockades, so they did it. That group created a peace march so that the churches could be involved, the refugees and migrants can be involved, and so parts of the community could participate. And then we also agreed that those people wanted to do a blockade would actually strategize for blockades and actions like that. And both groups didn't need to mix on those two occasions if they didn't want to, but we would support each other by coming together in the peace march at the end, and we would all walk together unified in that focus, so that Palmerston North committed to a peace march. Also, some of the difficulties is working with people with varying degrees of health. And so I think most actions have first aid people, but also people with mental health experience. And that's where our emotional first aid also comes in to be helpful. It's just been really thoughtful and considerate, and that requires some patience and time. So that can be challenging work as well. The other challenging thing is definitely making sure that we follow people who get arrested. So if people participating with us, following them, they get arrested, to the court or the police station, through the court process, and just ensuring that they are not left alone once the action is done. I think that's quite a lot of feedback we receive is, and we're conscious about that, is that if you're coming to join us, we have some limitations, but we will work to support you if you get arrested in the actions, because, what we've agreed to has got you arrested. Then we will support you until the end of your court case. These are just some photos of the various activities and the people that have joined us. It's very diverse. We have managed to reach different pockets of the community by actually embracing them and being really clear about what our objective is, and really clear around how we want to achieve those strategies, and finding spaces for other people in the community to participate. Sometimes when groups don't agree with each other, or they might have some clashes, and then we find spaces where they're not together, but they can still participate in the action. So I think that's the thing around relationships. Even though we're all for blocking or shutting down the arms trade, sometimes when groups have some differences, we don't have to exclude them. We just take different days of the week. We take different times in the day where we do our actions, because we can always all contribute to the end result.
Thank you so much, Teo. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and all of those tips. And we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So I want to move on to the next speaker in our lineup. It is Siana Bangura. Siana is a writer, producer, performer, and community organizer hailing from Southeast London. Siana is the founder and former editor of the Black British feminist platform No Fly on the Wall. She is also the author of a poetry collection called Elephant, and the producer of 1,500 and Counting, a documentary film investigating deaths from custody and police brutality in the UK. Siana works on campaigns on issues of race, class, and gender and their intersections. And Siana is currently working on projects focusing on climate change, the arms trade, and state violence. Siana is the training and events co-coordinator at the Campaign Against Arms Trade, a UK-based organization working to end the international arms trade. Siana, welcome.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for that warm welcome. Thank you, Teo, for your really illuminating presentation. It's really interesting to see the similarities in the challenges, the tactics, the slogans, and all of those kinds of things. So I'm going to quickly just share my screen with you folk. So give me a moment. Hopefully, okay, great. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to also just put us into this view. Great. Okay, then. So yeah, I do many things. One big thing is I work at Campaign Against Arms Trade, and I'm the training and events coordinator. And depending on who asks, one of the people who leads on causing a bit of a ruckus for arms dealers in the UK and beyond. So this presentation is very much thinking about, again, it was good to see this slogan about war starts here, thinking about where does war start and how do we resist. so for those of you who may not know, a bit of information about Campaign Against Arms Trade. So we've been kicking about really for about 40 years, and we organised to end the international arms trades. We believe that, of course, the arms business has a devastating impact on human rights, security, lives, the planet, and so on and so forth. And obviously you can find out a lot more about us online. We have quite a large online footprint. Some of our key focuses include stopping the procurement of exports of arms where they do the following things: exacerbate conflict, support oppressive regimes, and threaten social welfare through the level of military spending. We are working to end all government, political and financial support for arms exports, and we want to promote progressive demilitarization within arms producing countries. Projects like Arms to Renewables. Oops. Oh, trying to move my, so this quote here, important. We are moving towards a holistic approach, shall we say, when it comes to thinking about the arms trade and its intersections. As poet, Black feminist, Audre Lorde famously said, there are no single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. So it means that issues like the arms trade cannot be seen in silo. They have to be seen alongside understanding that their fundamentals, their foundations include and are exacerbated by things like colonialism, racism, capitalism, so on and so forth, all the isms that we love to hate. And it's really important to also think about security and the ways that this idea intersects with things like climate justice and injustice, and that although it's framed as some of our biggest threats being people and the free movement of people, actually we should be thinking about our biggest threats being things like climate damage and that causing resource issues, and also like things that many of us, all of us are currently living through, such as pandemics. As I said, just some of the things that, you know, the arms trade intersects with: racism and anti-Blackness, colonialism, sexism, classism, queerphobia, Indigenous rights, as Teo obviously spoke to us about, anti-capitalist struggle, and so on and so forth. And again, you know, as we move through our work, we are trying more and more to make sure we're communicating these things holistically, clearly, making sure that people are understanding that all these issues are interlinked, and that centering these issues as alongside the work we do isn't a tangent, but fundamental to making sure that we campaign well and make sure that the right people and the right voices are at the front. And this is like an ongoing work, definitely, at Campaign Against Arms Trade. So just thinking about, I wanted to highlight, I'm going to talk a bit about, particularly about DSEI, which is one of the world's largest arms fair, arguably, depending on the kind of measurements you use, the world's largest arms fair. Sometimes it's also referred to as the third, but the big thing is that it's in the top three of the world's largest arms fair. And I just think it's always interesting to see its full name, Defence and Security Equipment International. It's a massive euphemism, right? Really stark to note that the UK government spends about 45 billion a year on military spending, okay? If you compare it to kind of the, what is it, scant 14 billion or something like that, that we put into things like thinking about saving our earth. And after several years of austerity in the UK, where we've been told there was no magic money tree by our former Prime Minister, there's always still money for war. And the DSEI Arms Fair is an interesting one. So it takes place on the odd years of the year, every 2 years. So it took place last year in September, and it's coming back in 2021 at the London's Excel Centre. Now, the DSEI Arms Fair, a bit of information for you just to really bring it home. So last year, it featured 1,600 exhibitors from around the world, displaying a range of snipers, rifles, tanks, aircrafts, warships, you name it, they have it. And of course, they were joined by official delegations, including those from known human rights abusing regimes and countries involved in conflict, as well as tens of thousands of trade visitors. Think of it this way. I mean, we know how it is. In the same way you might go shopping for sneakers, for shirts, for your groceries, this is how it's kind of presented. You go and shop for weapons that kill people. And what's really stark to think about is that at the Excel Centre, which I'll talk a little bit about because it's been an interesting space with regards to the COVID pandemic. So the Excel Centre very, very large exhibition space in London, in the Docklands area, and it is in the borough of Newham. Now, Newham borough is a very important one, particularly thinking about the ethnic makeup, and also thinking about the class makeup of this particular borough in the UK. It slaps even harder in the faces of people, because a lot of the diasporas of people of countries that the UK is very responsible for damaging live in Newham. Lots of Black and brown people, and then to be the home of the DSCI Arms Fair is a massive slap in the face. So we do a lot of work with Newham locals, particularly last DSCI in 2019. We had Newham Against the Arms Fair, lovingly known as NATAF. And they, really stepped up and got the local community involved, because even though this exhibition has been going on since about, I believe it's 2001, we kind of, and I'll talk about that as well in a moment, but since 2001, it's still something that's very shrouded in kind of secrecy, and a lot of people still do not know that this happens in London. And so they did a lot of work on just kind of raising that consciousness, because we did find actually when people across the political spectrum, when people do realize that this is happening on their doorsteps, although it shouldn't happen on anyone's doorstep, but they're very keen for it to be pushed out of their doorstep. They're very keen to challenge it. And what's really interesting, as I mentioned, with Excel Centres, so every 2 years, and it's the home of where people come to shop for weapons that kill people. But during this COVID outbreak, interestingly, it was turned into, maybe you heard about it, it was turned into the Nightingale Hospital. After much persuasion, by the way, from the government, but it was turned into the Nightingale Hospital, which was supposed to kind of, boost the capacity of the NHS. Now, although we that's a great move in the right direction, making sure that that space is used to preserve life rather than take it. It is important to note, though, that it could have been seen as a bit of a PR stunt, mainly because, again, these issues interconnecting, mainly because due to years of austerity in the UK, hammering the NHS and making sure that we don't have enough nurses, there weren't actually enough nurses to even staff the Nightingale Hospital. So in many ways, it maybe didn't really fulfill its full capacity as being a useful space. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as a bit of irony there, really. I'm going to escape my screen really quickly. And this is a picture, a piece of art by Ahmed Jahaf. Know his name. I'll mention him a little bit more later, but he's a Yemeni artist based in Yemen, and we do a lot of work with him at Campaign Against Arms Trade, CAT. And I'm just going to escape for a second, and I'm going to then share my screen. Whoops, 1 second. Fiddling with the tech. So I'm going to now change the screen that I'm sharing so I can show you a video. Okay. Good. Okay, so this is just a little summary of how we cause a ruckus, basically. So enjoy. Okay, so let me just stop that screen share and start my presentation screen share once more. Okay, cool. So one moment. Fiddling around with a lot of things on the screen. Okay, we're back. Cool. So that was a video of just a bit of a summary of how we do things at Campaign Against Arms Trade, the DSEI week of action. And it's important to say that, you know, you can see just from that clip, a lot of the similarities in kind of tactics and creative direct action, and also, you know, heavy policing and that kind of thing. And interestingly, although it's just too much to even begin to go into in this particular conversation, but there's a lot to talk about with regards to kind of the militarization of police, and actually how that translates into how, you know, campaigners themselves on the ground are treated, and how that is important to note that, and actually not all campaigners are treated equally. And so when we have campaigners of color, we have queer campaigners, so on and so forth, you know, visibly Muslim campaigners, stuff like that, we know that the police always have a heavier hand with them versus maybe some of our white Quakers, for example. But just to show you kind of what we do there, building up to this, we've been for the last few years doing a conference called It Starts Here. Again, with that theme of kind of getting people ready to take part in this week of action. So in terms of the week of action, its current shape, as its name is a week kind of stretched from Monday to Sunday with different themes. And as a bit of history, just kind of before really going into it, so stretching back as far as 2011, in response to this arms fair that happens every 2 years, the DSEI arms fair, we held a day of action, and that's evolved into several days of action and turned into this coordinated week. And there's a bit more history of kind of the DSEI arms fair itself. So as I said, it opened its doors in 2001 September, and not only that, on the day of the Twin Towers atrocities. So it opened on September the 11th. While the world watched pictures from the Twin Towers aghast, inside the Excel Centre, they were busy in full swing having their arms fair. And we, you know, documented this, and there's interesting stuff on the CAT blog, but I just took a quote from someone who wrote something for us, obviously, many years ago. And it was a quote saying, "Surreal, utterly incredible and shocking. The arms dealers were still driving up. That disgusted me more than anything." Just to kind of really hammer it home. I know that obviously you signed up to this talk, so you don't need anything hammered home for you, but it's just to really highlight that it's just so insidious. So with that in mind, we've kind of at this stage, the current form of our resistance is this week of action. So in the past, and kind of stretching out over this week, we've had things including, you know, legal observer training to make sure that people are able to know how to handle when the police treat them badly or treat others badly, coordinated by Green and Black Cross, you know, talks, including things around kind of the British government and the arms trade, all sorts of things like, we've got lots of action from kind of religious campaigners, drop-in session, vigils, all that kind of stuff. And over the years, all of this, rather than being squished into one day, we put it into this week. And so Monday, typically, its theme has been stop arming Israel and or stop arming Saudi. So particularly in 2019, stop arming Saudi, stop arming Israel. These are the themes, pictured by our photographer Darren Johnson there. So the Monday, you know, historically has been coordinated in partnership with the likes of War on Want, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So that's kind of an example. Tuesday, I was really pleased to see, you know, it seemed, I don't know whether they were religious or not, if it was kind of part of the action, but there were some similarities in Teo's presentation that reminded me of some of our week of action aspects. So including Tuesday's No Faith in War, religion against the arms trade. So particularly a lot of Quakers in Britain and our comrades from other religions as well, kind of coming, praying, taking up space, and, you know, causing a ruckus as well, actually, blockading, but using their religious conviction, and that's we've seen that's been very, very effective in resistance. Wednesday, again, lots of similarities in the previous presentation. So this is kind of, you know, for historically been our day to connect the no nuclear struggle with the anti-arms trade campaigning. Tends to be in the past, the day where people who are arrestable will certainly kind of take up space, local groups and kind of factions such as Mad Hatters, for example, doing that, doing that kind of thing, lock-ons, all of that kind of stuff, with the aim, the ambitious aim to actually stop the arms fair from going ahead. And at this point, it's probably useful to note that the DSEI Arms Fair happens the week after currently anyway, it happens the week after our week of action. There's been a lot of reasons for this, and it's definitely an evolving structure, one that we're actually looking at now. But the thinking behind this current version of it was the aim to stop the expo happening. Obviously, we unfortunately haven't been successful, but we have had successes along the way, including getting people inside and then kind of reporting and stuff, but it is important to note too that it's important to keep the tactics fresh, because people, the police and organisers do catch on, and so it makes every year that bit more difficult to have successes. Thursday, conference at the gates. So this is our kind of academia against the arms trade. So we've got Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper there. But this is the time for kind of our university students and our universities networks and young people and academics and just people interested in learning more or talking about their research and things like that. Use the tactic of having a conference at the gates. So the gates are east and west, and they block it by having an academic conference. So that's been a historical tactic that we've used as well in kind of knowledge sharing, creating space for discussion, and also making sure that although there is that blockading aspect, but there are many people who are not arrestable and may not want to do something like this. So it's providing options. So if you do not want to do something that might make you more susceptible to being arrested, there are other kind of things that you can be involved in, and it's effective. In 2019, so last year, we had our Climate Justice Day, focusing on that intersection between climate justice, climate destruction, and the arms trade. We worked with Global Justice Now on this particular day of organising, along with kind of working groups and individuals as well. Saturday is our Festival of Resistance. This is actually a photo, I say this year, when I say that I mean 2019, the latest instalment of our Week of Action. We actually had protesters from Hong Kong join us, which was really powerful. The theme was definitely this international solidarity. And again, our photographer Darren took these great photos, and we kind of just had those discussions around international solidarity and what does that look like. Again, this Saturday is usually reminiscent of the original day of action, family friendly, a range of issues across the day, that kind of thing, trying to have some fun as well. Sunday, so we have last year and years in the past too, this is our day for no borders, anti-borders campaigning, migrant justice, refugee issues, and the arms trade. Again, interlinked, because as we remember, the arms trade is a racist trade. The arms trade is a colonialist project, right? And it's a way for Western powers to police the world and to use people and planet as a resource. And so this particular photo, I think, is beautiful. Again, it's a picture of some young people from a project called Advocacy Academy. It's based in Brixton, South London, building the capacity of young people to campaign from a very young age. And so they joined us and blessed us with a live performance, which also served as a tactic to block. A live performance of what it should look like to be a young person, to be a child, to play. And so it was kind of, there are videos as well on YouTube, so you can see those, but they're in the sunshine playing, getting us all involved, and all of a sudden there is like a bang, and then all of them drop dead, basically. And it's very stark, and it really gets you in the gut, basically. But it's this idea of, this is what childhood should look like, but this is what it looks like actually in places like Yemen, for example, where there is war, and Britain is actively involved in that war, in providing the weapons to sustain that war. So really powerful. And so I wanted we talked a lot about DSEI because that is one of our biggest actions, but there's other things that go on too across the year and in the alternate years that DSEI isn't on. So just a note on kind of other arms fairs. So we have things like security and policing that took place this March, before we had the lockdown in the UK. There's also Farnborough International. So just as an FYI, that we thought was cancelled, and then we saw information earlier this week or end of last week that it's actually going to now be a virtual exhibition. We've seen that they're still probably working out the details, but they're not stopping. So 20th to 24th of July, Farnborough International is going digital, and we're now working out what's our tactic and how we're going to respond to that. What are our tactics? And although it really sucks, but it's an interesting moment for us to practice and try out some of these online campaigning disruptive tactics that we're trying to develop, because one thing about campaign against arms trade, it's really important to be on the ground and in person, but obviously that kind of way of organizing is clearly not pandemic proof. So we're obviously having to learn our lessons and think about, well, what else can you do? And even beyond a pandemic, there's lots of reasons why you need to think of other ways to be accessible in your campaigning. There are people who can never make it on the ground with you. How else can they cause a ruckus? How else can they show solidarity? How else can they take part, basically, in ways that work for them right from home or when they're not based in London? And I just wanted to give you a bit of a shout out. I'll give you some information about the ADS dinner, otherwise known as Dining with Deaf. So obviously familiar face over there in that photo. So the ADS dinner takes place every January. And so again, that happened this year. So it happens outside the Grosvenor Hotel in London, fancy part of London, basically very, very central. And it is, again, the early stages of where war begins. So we have these arms dealers, or they like to call themselves engineers. They very much make a point that they are engineers. So arms dealers and engineers have banquets and feast and have a really great time, they think, until we come there and disrupt things. But you know, they go, they feast, they banquet, whilst at the same time 14 million Yemeni people are at risk of famine, starved as a result of the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of their country. And many of these bombs are made by the arms companies that are present at this dinner and have been sold with the support of the politicians in attendance, particularly from the UK. And if you want to see more, you can go to the CAT Facebook page. There's a fantastic video of this year's actions. And we got young people from Woodcraft Folk involved in that as well. They're all dressed as the Grim Reaper and stuff like that. It's very powerful. And so I mentioned Yemen. Obviously, there are lots of countries that war has destroyed, that the UK has destroyed historically and presently. But just a note on Yemen, particularly because that's, you know, that's central to the CAT kind of Stop Arming Saudi campaign, and also was central to the CAT court case. Won't go into that now, because again, please feel free to Google us, look us up. We had a landmark CAT court case where we took the UK government to court to follow its own rules, and we won. That said, they're obviously now ready to challenge us and undo that win, but it's still a win for now. And so precarious win, but win nonetheless. So it's important to look that up and feel, because as Teo was talking about looking at what you have succeeded in, what you have won, look at that. And even if your world isn't campaigning against the arms trade, if you're a campaigner of any kind, it's important to see that other strands of campaigning have had wins. So look that case up. Now, a quick word on Yemen. Again, since March 2015, a Saudi-led coalition has been bombing Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world, killing thousands of civilians and creating a humanitarian catastrophe at scales not seen before, basically. So lots of information here. You can find all this information again at the CAT website online. But it's important to note that, you know, there's been specific tactics to hit hospitals, schools, food warehouses, supply lines, destroying essential infrastructure, and millions of people are facing starvation, okay? Save the Children estimated that 85,000 children may have died from extreme hunger or disease since April 2015. And not to also forget that this is the same country that, according to WHO statistics, World Health Organization, this is a country still dealing with cholera. Noted that there are about 2,000 outbreaks a day in Yemen of cholera, a disease that has been wiped out in almost every other country. So then you think about the COVID landscape now, and we know that if there was to be a COVID outbreak in Yemen, it would add to this already existing catastrophe. And so that cannot be allowed to happen to an infrastructure, a health system that is already on the brinks of a complete struggle, basically complete collapse. And so just to end, I wanted just to show some resources, basically. There's lots, but obviously the CAT website is a given, but I didn't want to just put that there. Feel free to take a photo of this screen, but also you know that the recording is going to be shared, so this will be there. But there's a beautiful zine called To Yemen with Love. Again, you know, support them. CAT actually bought a bunch of them to give out, so there may be some on our website, but obviously things are a bit difficult with regards to logistics at the moment because everybody's working from home. But there's even just thinking about kind of climate justice and stuff like that. We've got a recent report by Sam Polo Freeman, one of our researchers, Fighting the Wrong Battles. Our friends at War and Want and London Mining Network, Justice Transition. So again, some stuff around climate, particularly thinking about what I mentioned for the Friday stuff. Wretched of the Earth Collective, Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike, and then, as I said, Ahmed Jahaf, who is a Yemeni artist, and I encourage you to follow his work, support his work. He's doing really important things. And on Ahmed, so this is my final slide. Powerful images here. He actually is, one thing I wanted to mention towards the end is, alongside our week of action, we have something called we have something called the Arms Fair exhibition. And so this exhibition runs alongside our week of action, and for the artists, and an interesting way to reach people who aren't the kind of usual suspects, already kind of campaign-y head. And this year, well, again, last year, it was actually based in Southeast London, I believe Peckham. So really good at reaching a whole, maybe like new community in many ways, but a community that actually is directly and indirectly affected by the arms trade, being of the diaspora of various relevant countries. And so Ahmed's work was on, is usually on sale. And so attracts, there's then an auction basically, and then that attracts kind of funding for campaign against arms trade and stuff like that. And I also wanted to mention that in 2017, Banksy himself actually donated a piece, and then that was bought, and then over £200,000 was raised for CAT and Reprieve. So really interesting in terms of thinking about tactics and other things that can be done alongside campaigning. And just to add, this really powerful quote by Angela Davis, for me, I think that it really sums up a lot of things. I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things that I cannot accept. And I think that that is a spirit that we should all hold in our hearts, our minds, and our spirit as we do this work. Never, ever forgetting the reason why we do it and who's at the heart of it, right? Whether we are, we should just keep thinking about the voices that should be at the front and the people that should be leading and kind of giving us guidance on how we do things, but never forget why we do this work. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Siana. So a quick time check. We have about 25 minutes left of this session. Please do use the chat box to put in your questions for our panelists. And if we don't get to everything, we can always follow up with you afterwards via email. We will send an email with the link to this recording and the link to all of the resources that our panelists have shared. So now I want to introduce, we have two more speakers who are from Ottawa, Canada, and they'll be talking about their experiences protesting CANSAC, which is the big, North America's largest weapons expo that we had been planning to protest this week, but it was canceled, thankfully, due to the coronavirus pandemic and also due to our efforts with petitioning and protesting it. And so Richard Saunders and Colin Stuart from Ottawa will talk about their years of experience protesting CANSAC, which was formerly known as Armex. So Richard, I want to turn it over directly to you to get us started with your discussion of a little bit of the history of CANSAC and Armex and some of the successes that you've had.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thanks very much, first of all, for inviting me to speak. And I've really appreciated listening to the other speakers so far and hearing some of the same sort of things that I've confronted, or, listening to the same sort of experiences that I guess we all share around the world in opposing the arms trade. I'm going to focus on the campaign that we had against Armex in 1989, because that was our biggest success, and we probably can have the most to learn from that. We've been trying to replicate the success of our campaign in 1989 ever since and have not been able to. So why was it so successful? Armex, first of all, it was the largest military trade show in Canada, and it actually was bigger than CANSAC is now. There were 450 military companies at Armex in 1989, exhibiting their wares, and all of the foreign embassies in Ottawa were invited except for the Warsaw Pact. This was back just before the Soviet Union was destroyed. In late 1988, I sent out a call to action, basically, and I formed the Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade, and the purpose of that was to launch a campaign to expose and oppose Armex. And at our second meeting, which was in January of '89, we had 60 people at the meeting representing 25 local and national organizations. So this was pre-internet days, pre-email days. And so the way to get people out to a meeting back in the dark ages of the even the late 1980s was to send an old-fashioned letter by the mail, which is now called snail mail. But back then it was just called mail. And anyway, I sent it out to a broad range of groups and activists, probably about 200 groups, to ask them to come to the meeting. As a result of that campaign that we started, 6 weeks before Armex happened, the city of Ottawa voted to ban all arms trade shows from municipal property. So that ban that we prompted through our campaign was in effect for 20 years. So, but although arms bazaars were allowed to happen in Ottawa, they could not use city facilities, city property. And this was a major blow to them because the privately owned and government-owned facilities were much smaller than the city's exhibition grounds, like where the city used to also hold the the exhibition, like the fair. And so over the 20 years that the ban was in place, CODE organized campaigns, that's Coalition to Oppose the Arms Trade. We organized campaigns against 10 different arms shows that were banished from city property. 4 of those shows, including Armex 91, because it was a biennial show. So there was one in 87, one in 89, and one in 91. Well, the one in 91 was canceled. It didn't happen. But that, they said, was because the war in Iraq, and they didn't think it would look good, I guess, if they were holding an arms bazaar during the war in Iraq, which was just more of a, shooting people, killing, blowing the place up, destroying water purification facilities, electrical facilities, sewage treatment plants and stuff like that, and creating biological warfare that eventually killed, what, 1 million people. But anyway, I don't have time to really talk even about Armex 89 in any thorough way, let alone the 10 different arms shows that we opposed since then. But if people want to know more, I've collected a lot of data, and there's a lot of articles and information on the COAT website where people can look and find out more information about all that stuff. And our website is coat.ncf.ca. NCF stands for National Capital Freenet. It's probably in the little blurb about me, what our website is. Anyway, the city did allow Armex 89 to go ahead, although it banned all future military trade shows from city property. And so we organized a huge protest, and we had several thousand people. We had maybe 3,000 people came out, and we marched through the whole of downtown, and ended up with a rally in front of the gates of Armex. And we also organized a public inquiry to expose the crimes against humanity and the crimes against peace that the arms companies and our government were complicit in. And we also held a large interfaith peace service and a conference on economic conversion. And after Armex was done, but that year, we launched a quarterly magazine called Press for Conversion. And during its first decade, it was a quarterly, so 4 times a year, so 40 issues through the 90s, all about the economic conversion of military industries to socially useful, environmentally sound production instead. And Press for Conversion is still coming out, and I'm just producing the 70th issue that'll be out this summer. But it doesn't deal with economic conversion anymore. It's been like since about the last 30 issues have been more about, various different themes, different wars, different examples of Canadian complicity in war. Anyway, another thing that the COAT campaign sparked, it inspired our federal New Democratic Party, which began as a socialist sort of a party, but they've removed socialism from their anything to do with them. As they've gotten closer to power, they've become more like the liberals and conservatives. But anyway, that's another point. But back then in 1989, and still the NDP still does a lot of great stuff. I don't want to completely seem like I'm criticizing them. But anyway, back in 1989, the NDP organized a full day debate in the House of Commons on Armex, because each party gets a certain number of days per year in Parliament when they can force all the parties to spend the whole day debating a certain topic, depending on how many members they have in the House and that sort of thing. So they organized an opposition day debate about Armex. That was great. That helped to promote, spark awareness about it, and also forced the Liberals and Conservatives to basically come out and say they supported the arms trade, which was no surprise. And back in those days, I had good close working relationships with several NDP members of Parliament on the left of the party. And we had another opposition day debate that the NDP, or the NDP had another one that was inspired by Coate's campaign, and that was to deal with Canada Pension Plan. That's our national government pension fund, and the investments in the world's largest war industries. But our biggest success was in basically, we made millions of people in Canada aware for probably the first time that Canada was even involved in the arms trade. We provoked hundreds and hundreds of mainstream newspaper articles about Armex throughout 1989 for the 5 months during our campaign leading up to Armex, as well as for months afterwards. So there were hundreds of mentions of Armex on the mainstream TV and radio stations, and hundreds more, and as you can imagine, in progressive publications and newsletters of community groups and peace groups and human rights groups and development groups and all those progressive groups. They of course all reported on it in their publications as well. And then there was community radio, community TV, and no campaign, I don't think, ever since then, well, certainly not since then or even before, had anything close to the success that we had in '89. So what the heck happened? Why was it so successful? The closest we ever came, just before I go on to explaining why it was so successful, I'll just say that the closest we ever came to replicating that success of '89 was 20 years later in 2008, when I learned that there were 3 military expos that were being planned to be held on city property after a 20-year ban. I contacted my list of thousands of Coate supporters and produced a flurry of resources, and we started a whole new Coate petition that collected another 5,000 signatures. We had a petition in '89, we got 5,000 signatures or so on it, and we've got another 5,000 on a Coate petition in 2008 to City Council to say stick to your resolution. I worked full-time organizing events and protests for Coate and the movement against the arms shows that were scheduled in 2008, and they were canceled. Those 3 shows were canceled, but we can't take all the credit for that, because they, or maybe even any of the credit, I don't know, they did in part blame the opposition groups. They said they were afraid that there was going to be damage and destruction, and we were not going to cause any damage or destruction. Maybe it was a way of making us look bad. But also there was an election called, and the government people were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to speak about anything at any public conferences. So a big part of the CANSEC was having these big public fora where the government officials can come and blab on about defense and security and all that kind of all those kind of euphemisms. But anyway, we were not able to stop City Council from ending its 20-year ban, so the ban was ended, and CANSEC was held for the first time on city property. But we did have a protest of about 400 people, and which wasn't as good as having 3,000 as we did in '89. But anyway, the city of Ottawa, to its great shame, voted to allow arms shows back onto city property. But that didn't last long, because there was a new facility built way out by the airport, and so CANSEC's been held there for the last 10 years or so, and the protests have been like maybe 50 or 100 people per year since then. So the $64 trillion question is, why was Coate's campaign so successful in 1989 when we had thousands of protesters, and we reached probably millions of people through all those newspaper articles, et cetera, et cetera. So here's a few of the key things that I think were responsible for the success. First of all, it was the 1980s, and around the world, people were really concerned about nuclear war. You know, the Americans had stationed nuclear weapons in Europe in the early 80s, 83, I think, or 84. And so the peace movement was very active. And in 1983, Pierre Trudeau, who's the father of our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he approved the testing of US cruise missiles in Canada. And the movement against cruise missiles was the focus of much energy of the peace movement. But by 1989, the peace movement needed a new target. I guess people were a bit bored, you know, 5 years of protesting cruise missiles or whatever. You can't maintain an opposition to one weapon system for that long. So they needed a new target, something to coalesce around. And that's, so when I gathered all this data about Armex and packaged it into a call to action, the idea really took off. And the lesson that I learned in the 1980s was that a successful campaign required activists to have a target. I don't like to use the word target, but anyway, it's a good word. You have to pick the biggest, ugliest, most gross symbolic manifestation of everything that we oppose. And Armex was, you know, it fit the bill. It was the perfect target. You know, like what better target could you ask for than a big weapons show with 450 military companies? So there was a few reasons, and you know, excuse me for being personal here, but a few personal reasons why I think it was about my own background that I think helped. One thing, I was raised in a peace movement family by two veterans of the World War II who became social justice and ban the bomb activists in the early 1950s. And my mom especially was a key planner and organizer in Ottawa, in the Ottawa peace movement, and supporting the American civil rights movement, bringing up civil rights leaders and anti-Vietnam War leaders from the US up to Canada to speak, and etc. And they were involved in protesting apartheid in South Africa as well as the United States, and atmospheric testing, all the big peace movement sort of just social justice, human rights causes of the 50s and 60s and 70s. So by the time I became a full-time peace activist in 1984, I've been working full-time in the peace movement since 1984, since I graduated from university. By the time I got involved for the first, you know, as a full-time activist in 84, they'd already been involved in the movement for 30 years. So they knew everybody who was anybody in the peace movement. And so I knew everybody. I mean, I didn't know everybody, but I mean, through my parents, I kind of knew all these people because they were all friends. They're all friends of the family, and they introduced me to people. And so they were a great asset for me, you know, to carry on in their footsteps, so to speak. The second big personal factor was my connection to a network called the Alliance for Nonviolent Action. Now, Alliance for Nonviolent Action, that's ANVA. It was a network of anti-war groups and activists across Ontario and Quebec that was doing civil disobedience actions throughout the 1980s. And it arose out of the cruise missile conversion project because Canada was making the guidance systems for cruise missiles. So I became very involved in ANVA and was on its organizing committee. And we organized civil disobedience actions, a lot of blockades and sit-ins and that sort of thing in Ontario. Mostly the ones I was involved with were in Ontario. And anyway, and I was like the key activist in ANVA for Ottawa. And so I was involved in planning, organizing, arranging the logistical aspects for ANVA actions in Ottawa for 5 years before Armex. And my parents and I were both arrested several times in Ottawa, once when they were wearing their military medals. And I was arrested about 20 times in the late 80s. Anyway, ANVA organized a big blockade of the gates at Armex the day after our big rally. And so 150 people were arrested. And I think I've never heard of such a huge mass arrest in Ottawa history. And I don't even know of any mass arrests that large of 150 people anywhere in Canada in history. So maybe it was the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. I don't know. All the charges against us were dropped. So we never got our day in court to put the real criminals on trial, which is what we always tried to do in our actions. We always want to put them on trial, call witnesses and that sort of thing, and make our case, and then hopefully not go to jail. ANVA activists like myself, we wanted COAT to endorse the blockade. We wanted COAT to endorse the ANVA blockade, where ANVA blockaded all the gates. So in advance, we said, hey, let's have a vote. You please support this nonviolent direct action. But we lost. There were a few people that were dead against it. And I'm afraid to say Project Plowshares, which is the largest peace group in Canada, it's the national body of Project Plowshares. They threatened to withdraw from code if we endorsed the ANVA action. Plowshares National, which produces great resources on the arms trade, it represents Canada's mainstream churches. And so they're a kind of naturally cautious group, and they've since then received millions of dollars in government contracts, but they've never organized a protest. Local plowshares groups are get involved with protests, but not the national. Anyway, the third factor was that in 1984, I had become the coordinator of Ottawa's Peace Resource Center, and I was responsible for pulling together and distributing the resources and educational materials and contact information for hundreds of local and national groups in Ottawa. Because we're the capital, we have all these national organizations as well as our local groups. So I had a broad view of the peace movement and included human rights and third world development and Central America solidarity, which was big at the time because of Iran-Contra and all that, and the anti-war and anti-nuclear activism. So that gave me the knowledge of all of these groups, and that was very helpful to know who all the groups were. A fourth factor was that I was young and I had a lot of energy and determination and commitment, and I was pretty much totally focused on the peace movement, and I didn't have much of a personal life. And so, I could just burn myself out doing all this work. And I didn't have a wife and teenage kids like I do now. Another factor was that I did a radio show at the time through the 80s and 90s. So for almost 20 years, I did a community radio show based at Carleton. I had started one at Ottawa, but I ended up doing it at Carleton. And I used that radio show as an excuse, as a pretext to get myself inside RMX in 1987. So in 1987, the one before RMX 89, because again, it was a biennial thing, I got inside RMX, and very few people, peace activists, get inside weapons trade shows. So I got inside, and I even did a lengthy interview with the main organizer of RMX. His name was Wolfgang Schmidt, and he had a thick German accent, and he wore a long black leather coat. Anyway, stereotypes aside, this gave me a special insight into what RMX was all about. And I went around to all the booths, all the tables, and I gathered all of the company's glossy materials. Again, it was pre-internet, so you couldn't just go online and Google a company and find out what they made, So it was very helpful to go around to all those booths, visit all the booths, and collect all their pamphlets and all their glossy handouts. There was even a guy there, a booth there from China, and there were no booths from any of the Warsaw Pact countries. There's no way they were going to invite them, but they had the Chinese military producers there. They didn't mind the Chinese for some reason. Anyway, interesting.
Richard, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. We are going to transition to Colin now, so we can give him a chance to share a little bit about what he's been doing as well. I just want to check in with everyone and say that we are running a little bit behind on time, but that's okay. We will make time for Colin, and then we will do a very short Q&A. And again, if we don't get to your question, we have it saved in the chat so we can follow up with you afterwards. And then we will transition to our second panel, probably around 4:40 p.m. Eastern time. So Colin, I do want you to have a chance now to unmute yourself and share what you've been doing in Ottawa to protest CANSAC.
I know people want to ask lots of questions, and they're out there, so I'm going to keep it as short as possible. I'm going to shift right to the challenges, but before I'm doing that, Ao's presentation to me was all the points she went through, the 7 points she went through, we've gone through recently here in Ottawa. These are the things we need to look at to strengthen our opposition to the arms trade. What are the challenges? I want to thank Ao for that, but particularly for her, for the insight she gives into the importance of bringing Indigenous people in the First Nations into the reality of the struggle against the arms trade that we have. What are the challenges we face? That's the first one. It's the taking leadership in the among or exceeding leadership in the movement to marginalized peoples, because they're the ones most affected by it. That's a tough challenge because historically we've been very much engaged in a different process. The other challenge, and I think we were going to get at it this year, was the climate crisis. Let me go back to the Indigenous crisis first. When CANSEC, well, just before CANSEC was supposed to go on 2 days ago this year, Canada has been through a semi-shutdown of its economy. That's before COVID started. And it was the shutdown of the economy was the blocking of railway lines across the country by Indigenous folks. And this has been to us an incredible inspiration, realizing that we are part of a larger struggle in this opposition to the war and to weapons. The third challenge is conversion. Everything we do, I think, in terms of our opposition to the weapons trade has to speak to the question of conversion to some kind of green alternative, Green New Deal, if whatever terms we want to use. And there's a lot of it's very significant debate going on this. We've been struggling here with a small group. We have done some things that have been, I wouldn't call them outright successes, but they've been important. Number one, we have put on notice the Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries that they're not going to be able to get away with the kind of old boys club of discussions between the military and government departments in terms of sales of weapons and support they get from the Canadian government, the weapons trade. That's important. We've had demonstrations, and a demonstration and public presentations in highly trafficked areas of the city that made this clear. There's a lot more work to do around this, but we're going to do it. And I think here and now, in terms of the peace movement here, both locally in Ottawa and across the country, what we have to do is build much, much stronger links with World Beyond War and other peace groups in the United States. Let me just cite one concrete example that I've realized in the last month or so. For example, the Plowshares 7. Some of you may or may not have heard of their attempt to get in and destroy or upset the Trident missile operations there. Well, that's really important, because how can we support them and how they can support us? What do we have in common? We have General Dynamics. General Dynamics is the company that's been making the light armored vehicles and so on that are going to Saudi Arabia. We've had our protests here against Canada's engagement with this. We have failed yet to stop that contract, unfortunately. We're going to need support from the United States to do that. And in turn, we have to support groups like Plowshares, obviously World Beyond War, in the changes that need. That border, in a certain sense, to the peace movement, I think has to become transparent. That we have to support those groups in the United States to a lesser extent, but certainly an important extent also in Britain. But this is subsequent. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to leave it there. I had a long piece prepared, but I'm just going to leave it at that. There's much more to say, but that's where we're at.
Thank you, Colin. And for those of us just joining us, we are in the middle of wrapping up our Weapons Expo panel before we transition to our next panel on economic conversion. So we do want to make some time for questions now, and then we will transition to the panel on economic conversion, and then we will also have more time for Q&A and discussion after that second panel. So some of the questions coming in, and this first one, I think any of the panelists can respond to. The question is, have you ever had to deal with police using tear gas or other kind of violence, either from the police or other forces during your protests?
I can share about in New Zealand. The force that we've had is not weapons thrown at us, but more police physically harming us in the hold they have. So they're quite well trained around how they can grab parts of our body and inflict pain while we are, like, for example, the blockades, they stand behind us. And so we've had to become more sharper on trying to capture that, and also devising strategies where we can identify those police who are trained in that area before they get there. So yeah, we've just got more eyes on everyone and calling them out so that we can get video cameras on them. That's been one of the strategies.
I think, yeah, I mentioned it in my, I actually mentioned it in my presentation that, yeah, 100%, we've had a lot of police violence and all these kinds of things. And tear gas, no, thank goodness, but certainly outside of even the immediate space of violence, particularly to our campaigners of colour, particularly to any campaigners who are like in 2019 as well, there was a lot of violence against our Bahraini campaigners, for example, but also just things in between in between those moments, you know, surveillance and you know, just making your life pretty uncomfortable kind of in between if you're a known campaigner. All of those things certainly happen, and there's conversation around kind of the increasing militarization of police training as well. So the answer is yes, basically, and not just on site, but if you're a known campaigner, lots of harassment by the police.
Richard or Colin?
No tear gas in my record. We have been on what might be called hassle lines with police, really face to face, right up in front. That was particularly before Armix or the CanSec show was moved from the exhibition site out to the rather remote place at the airport, which poses a challenge. But yes, the police have always been there. Ottawa police are very peculiar. They will give you polite arrests. They will hand you a ticket and say you've been arrested, and you wave it around a bit, but it's quite meaningless. So they do that as much as possible, and the media cooperates, and they don't give any publicity at all. So I'm sorry, it sounds a bit cynical, but that's the reality.
Richard, do you have anything to add on this question?
Well, just very briefly, there was tear gas used at a protest against CanSec. I think it was 2011 or 2010 or so. And I didn't get any in my eyes, but I was there and saw people who had just been hit by it. And there were a lot of people in a lot of pain. And there were some medics there who were putting, you know, like people's medics, putting water and stuff in people's eyes and trying to help them out. And the police also used bicycles as a kind of threatening tool of violence to push people and to get them to move. They held their bikes up and sort of drove them away. These were, this was a small group of people that were not really involved with our protests but they were nearby. And so when I saw this skirmish happening, I went over to see what was going on, and somebody had thrown a cup of paint at a bus carrying CanSec. I don't know who they were. They were either, you know, buyers, sellers, or users of weapons, and they were being brought into the arms show, and somebody threw a little cup of paint, and then this caused the police to just go wild and spray everybody with tear gas and use their bikes to drive them away. Anyway, that's the only time I know that tear gas was used in Ottawa against the arms show protesters.
Thank you, Richard. And welcome everyone. If you're just joining us, we are wrapping up our first panel on weapons expos. We have a couple more questions for these panelists before we transition to the second panel. So another question, this can be for all of the panelists as well, is how can we be global allies? If there's a weapons expo in the UK or in New Zealand and in Canada, and we're not in those locations, nevertheless, how can we still be allies in opposing these weapons expos around the world?
I'll jump in real quick, just to say that, again, short answer, what I would just say is, in the moment that we're in now, where there's this focus on digital, even though that has its own problems and kind of digital poverty and beyond the scope of this conversation maybe, but for instance, I saw some comments about Farnborough, although you're nowhere near Farnborough, but it's now digital, so there are ways that we can coordinate and you can join in our online actions. So that's for me one thing that folks can know, that, oh, people in New Zealand, people in Canada know about Farnborough. So something like that, show out, like the digital sphere opens a lot of opportunity for you folks to get involved.
Just a note, in some senses we already are, because the Coalition Against the Arms Trade in the 7 days that were involved in that, there was a significant number of arrests during that time. One particular group, I think it was the Quakers, for example, there was about 40 people arrested. I showed that video from that one event to a number of people here, and it was in fact truly inspirational. This is important. I mean, it sounds small, but it's really significant that that kind of thing happened. I've already mentioned the Plowshares 7. What we have in common is the companies, the nature of the government, particularly England and Canada. It's the Westminster system, and we have incredibly diverse communities that we're working with in this, and there's a lot to share. There's a lot of solidarity. We just have to find the right sheets to put it on, it seems to me.
Could I jump in here? Can I say a few words on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have a practical idea on how people in different countries can be involved in a protest where they're thousands of miles away. We did in 2001, we organized a thing against NATO. There was the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Ottawa, and the coalition to oppose the arms trade, not coalition against the arms trade, but coalition to oppose the arms trade. That's us. We did a protest, a vigil. Actually, it was right after September 11th, and we had planned to have this big festival of nonviolence out front of the U.S. Embassy, but then September 11th happened, and so we couldn't be anywhere near the U.S. Embassy. It would have been very scary. So what we did was we met on Parliament Hill and we had a silent vigil, and we walked to this church where we had a big conference basically. And what we did, one of the things that we did, was to have we had cell phones then. We'd already had the internet by this time, unlike '89. But we had our cell phones, and we got a couple of speakers. We plugged the cell phone into the sound system. So basically we had on the line Helen Caldicott from Australia, who did this famous movie, If You Love This Planet, which was banned by the United States. It was made by the Canadian National Film Board, but it was banned as propaganda in the US. Anyway, she was online and she spoke to our conference of about 500 people, 400, 500 people, and the sound came through fine. We also had on the line, through the cell phone trick that was plugged into the sound system, Arun Gandhi, who was the, I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know, he's living in the United States at the time. And he's the grandson of Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma Gandhi. And he gave a speech. So that's something that can be done. You can use your cell phones, plug them in, have somebody as a speaker. Like there's no limits, no boundaries to nowadays. It'd be even easier, I guess. You could have a Zoom thing, maybe with a big screen, and have your speaker from wherever addressing your protest. Maybe you can have a screen rolled up at the protest outside somewhere. Or another thing we did this is combining it with another idea that we did at another event, was we projected slides onto the outside wall of a building at night. And we had these huge images of children being shot, and airplanes and helicopters attacking families and villages in Central America. And it was the Latin American generals were having the Latin American Air Force generals were having their meeting in Ottawa. It was sponsored by the Canadian government, and all the Air Force generals from all through Latin America were here. And so we projected those images onto the wall of the building. So I wonder if we could have speakers and have them projected onto the wall of a building and have some famous speaker from whatever country X speaking in country Y. Just an idea.
Thank you, Richard. Teo, would you like to add something to this question?
I think with COVID-19, it's illustrated how, like, now we are collectively from many countries come together. So there's lots of ways that have been mentioned that we can do online solidarity. But also, if I was to do, if we were doing action in Aotearoa, New Zealand, people don't actually have to turn up physically. I think that's something we have to work through. We do call for numbers, but you don't have to come from other countries, because like Standing Rock and what's happening in Hawaii and also in Canada, some people require resources. And so if we sent resources rather than human bodies, or we sent people in those countries, if we knew someone, we could resource them to go to an action, then that way we would help the environment, but we also would give the resources that we would be spending on accommodation and maybe travel to the local people and neighbouring communities to actually turn up. I think developing the ability for neighbouring communities and local communities to actually attend their own actions and be resourced, I think that's something that we should think about. First Nations peoples, we've been doing this at the moment when we've had in Hawaii, they've had Mauna Kea with, and Standing Rock. Some of the calls are you don't have to turn up, but they do need resources. And what we can do, like in any country, if you can't physically arrive there, then you can contribute some time or some resource, and then it takes a lot of pressure off, and it really does help the organizers. As an organizer, I'd love if someone across some other country could do the newsletter or do something online, and then that would be one task that we would be free to actually be physically present somewhere with other people and engaging, or going to connect with our own people in our community. So those are, I guess it's about realizing that we don't have to be the faces to be present, and we don't all have to get our faces in the shots, or for people to know that we were physically there, but to enable someone else to be there and to alleviate the organizers or the participants. I think that would be a greater contribution that I would definitely welcome. And connect, keep the relationships going. I think I talked about it. Relationships are really important, not just in your own country or in your own towns or cities, but across nations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teo. And that is a wrap for our Weapons Expo panel. So thank you again, Teo, Siana, Richard, and Colin for sharing your expertise. And if you can stay on the call, if you're able to, we will have more time for discussion at the end of the second panel. So you're welcome to join us for that as well. So we have a request for a 2-minute break. So we will be taking a 2-minute break and coming back at 4:50 p.m. Eastern Time to start our second panel, which will be talking about economic conversion and how we can make that leap from a war-based economy to a peace-based economy. So see you all in 2 minutes, and then we'll hear from Tamara and Simon and Brent.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are now going to start our second panel of today's day 2 of the No War 2020 virtual conference. If you're just joining us, welcome. And this panel is all about economic conversion. You know, we talk a lot about the problems of war, and at World Beyond War, we debunk the myths of war, but we also need to talk about the alternatives and what that transition process is going to look like. So we have 3 excellent speakers today who will be sharing their strategies for how we can make that transition to a just and green and peaceful economy. So we will hear first from Tamara, who will open us up with this discussion of how we can make that transition and why demilitarization is necessary in order to decarbonize, talking about the carbon footprint of war. So Tamara Lorincz is a PhD student in global governance. She is also on the board of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the International Advisory Committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. She is a member of the Canadian Pugwash Group and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And she is also a new advisory board member of World Beyond War. So welcome, Tamara.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. That was a fantastic first panel. I am going to share my slides with you. It'll just take a second to get those up. Can everybody see my presentation okay and hear me all right?
Yes.
Great, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I think this topic, conversion from a war economy to a peace economy, is the most vital conversation that we can have. It is crucial to the survival of humanity. The image that you see before you is from a banner that was made by my friends in Maine. They have been protesting the building of the Aegis destroyers warships at the General Dynamics Bath Iron Works shipyard for many years. They have a campaign, they have a conversion campaign there, and they are calling on the plant to build renewable technologies like solar panels and trains and things like that. They also do peace walks across the state with this banner. And this is the type of image, this is the type of coordinated conversion campaign that we desperately need in Canada. So in my presentation today, I will talk about my efforts to protest Canada's war economy and call for conversion. For almost a decade, I have been campaigning against 2 of the largest and most expensive federal government procurement programs in Canadian history. This is the building of the new warships and the buying of the new fighter jets. I will also share some of the latest statistics on Canadian militarism and military spending, and I will conclude with some of my thoughts about the possibilities for conversion in Canada, upcoming events and resources. In June of 2010, the Harper government announced the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy, the NSS, to replace the ships for the Royal Canadian Navy and the Coast Guard. The strategy has 3 components: the combat package to build armed Arctic offshore patrol ships and to build 15 new surface combatants. These are warships. And the initial cost was for $25 billion. The second component is the non-combat package to build joint supply ships for the Navy, and this was valued at about $8 billion. And then the third part of this is the smaller non-Navy package to build a research vessel and to do some repair work, and this was valued at about $2 billion. So the federal government said that the NSS was needed to provide economic benefits to Canadians, to provide jobs, and to help rebuild the Canadian shipbuilding industry. All of the political parties supported the NSS. And in 2010, the province of Nova Scotia, which was led at the time by a historic majority NDP government, they unanimously passed a motion to support this strategy, and they launched a campaign called Ship Start Here to try to attract the combat vessel package, which was the most lucrative package, to Halifax. And so I started protesting this strategy. I wrote letters, I talked to members of parliament, I talked to MLAs, I passed out leaflets, I had lectures to try to say, we do not need the national shipbuilding procurement strategy. We don't need to be building new warships. Well, in October of 2011, the federal government announced that the Irving shipyard in Halifax would win this combat package, and the whole province was cheering. They were so excited. They were ecstatic that all of this money and all of these jobs would come to the province. None of the peace groups or the labor groups expressed any opposition because they didn't want to speak out against jobs for the province, but I was really outraged. And so a few months later, I launched a weekly protest called Wednesdays Against Warship, and I protested every Wednesday at noon for an hour, rain, shine, sleet, or hail. I made up these signs: action on poverty and climate change, no warships, demilitarize, green jobs, demilitarize. I protested outside of the Niobe Gate on Barrington Street. Now, this is the entrance for the Irving shipyard, and it's also the shared entrance for the Naval Dockyard. This is a highly visible location. Hundreds and hundreds, really thousands of workers and naval personnel pass through that gate every day, and many cars drive past that location as well. So I protested every Wednesday while my kids were in school. I also created this website, demilitarize.ca, and I created a blog about my weekly protest. I made up t-shirts, I wrote letters, I did a petition, I passed out leaflets, I protested outside all of the MP's offices. I also ran the Halifax Marathon in my shirt, no warships, green jobs, demilitarize. I did a province-wide high school essay contest. Instead of spending $25 billion on warships, how could Canada invest in a green and peaceful future? And I got lots of entries from high school students. I also went to Ottawa and I protested outside of Parliament, and I delivered open letters to all of the political leaders. And it was Kuzma, a great peace activist in the capital, that took this picture of me outside of Parliament, and I created all of these signs that I took on all of my protests. I also delivered a letter and a book to the NDP Premier, Darrell Dexter, and this book that I'm showing is William Hartung's book entitled Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. It's an absolutely excellent book. And strangers started protesting with me. There's a picture with people that I did not know, but they saw me protesting every week and they started to come out and join me. And there's also my cute kids with me with the signs. After 3 months of protesting, Carl Risser, the president of the Union of Shipyard Workers, came out to meet with me while I was protesting. He told me that he and all of the shipyard workers agreed with my signs. They agreed with my protests, and they supported a green economy. In fact, he told me that a few years before, the shipyard workers had prepared a report that they gave to the Irving company and said that they wanted to build fast ferries and light rail. And that's how they wanted to convert their plant. But that report got shelved and never got implemented, obviously. So now they're going to start building warships. He also said that in order for Canada not to have this militaristic agenda, that it will require many Canadians on the street and a big national effort for conversion. So that's what I was trying to spark with my protest. Unfortunately, I never heard from him again, and I didn't get any support from the labor groups. So I protested weekly for a year, but I had to end my campaign because we had an opportunity to move to the UK, and I was there for 2 years. But I would like to give you a little update about the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy. Last February, it was announced that Lockheed Martin won the design bid for these new surface combatants. And the design that they're using is BAE's Type 26 Global Combat Ship. And as you've heard, BAE is one of the most corrupt defense contractors on the planet, as well as Lockheed Martin, very, very corrupt. And then a few months after that, in June of 2019, the Independent Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that the combat package to build these new surface combatants is going to rise to $69.8 billion over the life cycle. I mean, that has dramatically increased from $25 billion that the government announced initially. And the other thing that's important here is that I spoke with a defense economist at the Royal Military College in Kingston, and he said that most of this money will not stay in Canada because the only thing that the Irving shipyard can build or do at that shipyard is to build the frame and the hull for these warships. All of the most lucrative parts of the ships, the navigation system and the weapon system, can only be built in the United States from plants there. So most of the money will actually leave Canada. So now I want to say something briefly about the environmental impacts of warships. There is lots of evidence and instances of oil spills and dumping by warships. There's munitions debris from naval exercises. The high frequency sonar and the noise of the explosives cause stranding. This is injuring and killing marine life. You can see this picture here from a report done in the United States, a whole bunch of whales that have been beached, and this is a direct cause from naval exercises. In 2012, US researchers contacted the Canadian Navy to inquire about Canadian warships causing the death of killer whales in British Columbia. And as you know, these whales are endangered. I also filed access to information to find out more information, and the government is not releasing all of the details about the impacts on killer whales from the Canadian Pacific Fleet. As you all know, our oceans are in peril. They are heating up because of climate change. Fish stocks have plummeted. Our oceans are contaminated and full of plastic, and there are more dead zones. There are now 500 dead zones in the ocean. It is unconscionable that Canada is building warships and they are putting them on our dying oceans instead of investing that money to try to repair and care for our oceans and for our marine life. Our warships and the war that we are conducting on the oceans are literally killing our oceans, and we need to stop this. Now, things are getting worse. It was just announced a couple of weeks ago that the Canadian Navy is going to participate in RIMPAC. This is the large US-led naval exercise that takes place in the Pacific Ocean. It usually is conducted over 3 months over the summer, but this year it's just going to be conducted in the month of August. The organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we are going to try to stop this along with other peace groups in the Pacific. So we're going to need your help. There is really no need for warships. Let's remind ourselves that in 2003, the Canadian government signed and ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. And this convention gives us a legal framework to deal with all conflict in the marine environment in a peaceful way. So we have legal institutions, we have diplomacy, we have nonviolent conflict resolution that can help us deal with any conflict in the marine environment. Now, the other campaign that I would like to talk to you about is the second most expensive procurement in Canadian history, and this is to buy the new fighter jets. So in 2009, the Harper Conservative government announced that it was going to buy 65 F-35 fighter jets to replace Canada's aging CF-18. But this was going to be without an open and transparent competition. The Halifax Peace Coalition, as well as many peace groups across the country, mobilized, and we started protesting. So this is a picture of my son with a Christmas card that we all signed. We took it to the Defense Minister Peter MacKay's office in Antigonish, Nova Scotia in December 2010. The Christmas card says no stealth fighters, invested children and education, end the war in Afghanistan, end oil subsidies, take action on climate change. And that's me in the background talking to MacKay's staff. In September of 2011, members of the Halifax Peace Coalition and the Nova Scotia Voice of Women for Peace protested DefSec. This is the largest arms fair that takes place every fall in Halifax. And you can see my sign there that says, cancel the F-35s, fund human needs, no to Lockheed Martin. So we joined this big national effort to try to get the Harper government to stop buying the F-35s. I also filed many access to information requests about the F-35s, and I discovered that the price that the Conservatives were saying did not include the price of the engines. Now, or the cost of the engines. And this is one of the most expensive parts of the fighter jet. And so I gave this access to information record to a Ottawa-based journalist named David Pugliese, and he wrote a front page story. It was actually picked up in all of the newspapers across the country. And because, because of this work and all of our mobilization, we were able to successfully force the Harper government to delay the purchase of the F-35s. And then in 2015, the Harper Conservatives were defeated in the election, and the Trudeau Liberals won, but they actually won on a campaign that they promised not to buy the Lockheed Martin F-35s, and they promised to hold an open and transparent competition for the new fighter jets. So last July, the Canadian government opened this competition. There are 3 companies in the running, Saab with its Gripen fighter jet, Boeing with its Super Hornet, and of course, Lockheed Martin with its F-35. Now you have to know that over the past 20 years, the Canadian government has been, the Canadian government has invested over $541 million to participate in the F-35 development consortium with 8 other countries. So many defense analysts and peace activists think that Lockheed Martin is going to win this fighter jet competition. The bids are due at the end of July of this year, and the Canadian government is going to make a decision in 2022 which fighter jet it's going to purchase. So we have time to stop the buying of the fighter jets. In March of this year, I decided I was going to start a campaign to try to stop the fighter jets. These are my new signs. This is me with members of the KW Peace Network. And we were going to start a monthly protest outside of our Member of Parliament for Waterloo, Bardish Chagger. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, we are not able to do that. But we've been writing letters to Bardish Chagger to say that we don't want the Canadian government to invest in new fighter jets. We want investment in a Green New Deal and post-pandemic recovery. This is an article that I just got published in Ricochet Media. Spending $19 billion on fighter jets won't fight COVID-19 and climate change. In that article, I explain how fighter jets are terrible for the climate and they lock us into a high carbon intense militaristic pathway, and we really need to stop them. So I've included the URL for this article in my resources that I will share with you at the end. So now I would like to turn to giving you some statistics about militarism and military spending in Canada. Last month, SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, released their report on global trends for military spending, and you can see at the arrow that Canada is ranked 14th highest for military spending. That's $22 billion US, which is equivalent to $30 billion Canadian. This is from SIPRI's arms transfer report for 2019, and you can see that for arms export, Canada is ranked 16th highest. We are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, India, and the UAE. Canada does not disclose adequate information about our arms transfers to the United States, but but we believe that it's the most for arms exports. So Canadian weapons are awash in the Middle East. It is causing terrible, protracted conflict there. And just the last thing that the Middle East needs is our weapons. And then also think about the fact that a poor country like India is buying our weapons, and there are Indian children that are stunted from malnutrition. It is just absolutely obscene that we're selling these weapons. So I also want to show you this graph. This is a graph that I made using the Public Accounts of Canada, showing military spending over time. In 1997, the Department of National Defense had $8 billion. Last year, its budget was $30 billion. The orange line there is spending for our paramilitary services. This is the RCMP, Border Patrol, and prisons. This is the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. And then those lines at the bottom in the purple, green, and blue, those are our environmental departments, the Department of Environment and Climate Change, the Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And you can see that those environmental departments have about $1 billion annually. This is just not enough money that's needed to deal with the climate and ecological crisis. Today is International Peacekeeping Day, and I just want to show you these statistics from the United Nations Peacekeeping Office. Canada is the lowest level in our history for peacekeeping. Canada is not doing peacekeeping seriously. We're currently ranked 77 with only 35 peacekeepers in UN operations. So it's very, very low. So we have a serious political problem in Canada. We have a highly militarized economy. In 2018, the Canadian government released a defense industrial policy. Canada does not have a green industrial policy. Canada does not have a green job strategy. There is not one politician or political party who will speak out against the warships or the fighter jets. None of them will call for a reduction in military spending. And the Senate is not doing anything seriously on peace and disarmament. We don't have one federal agency either that's doing anything on disarmament or conversion. And most importantly, we don't have any academic institution that's doing any serious research on disarmament, demilitarization, or conversion. So in order to change this, we really need a strong peace and anti-war movement in Canada. I wanted to say something about Seymour Melman, but he was the great American academic and leader of the conversion movement in the United States. He wrote a number of books, but I am going to skip this to save time so that we have more time for questions. But I just want to highlight the book that he wrote in 1988 called The Demilitarized Society, Conversion and Disarmament. It's a really powerful and prescient book, and I encourage you to read it. I will share my slides so you have this information. And this is a quote that I won't read, that I'll skip over. But I just want to say that we need to have courage in Canada to say publicly and to push for demilitarization. Demilitarization is critical to decarbonization and decolonization. And I think these are the three pillars that we need for a Green New Deal, a Red Deal, and a just recovery. I just want to bring to your attention two contemporary efforts for conversion. In 2014, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade released a really excellent report called Arms to Renewables. And last year, the nuclear ban group in the United States, which is part of the ICANN campaign, they released this excellent report called Warheads to Windmills, How to Pay for a Green New Deal. We need a similar study in Canada on conversion. In order for us to get serious about demilitarization and conversion, we need to begin by shutting down CANSEC. So this is a picture of us in May of 2019, protesting CANSEC. You can see that we're partnering with Extinction Rebellion folks. Business as usual equals death. Arms dealers aren't welcome. This is really fantastic. I just want to encourage you all to come to our our protest of CANSEC in June of 2021 and our excellent peace conference that we're going to have. We need a massive convergence so that we can shut down CANSEC. You can stay tuned and find details at the website World Beyond War. And I would just like to finally share some resources with you. I will send you all of my slides so you have this information, and I am looking forward to our discussion and hearing from the other panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. All right, our next panelist is Brent Patterson. Brent is the Executive Director of Peace Brigades International Canada, as well as an Extinction Rebellion activist and a writer with rabble.ca. And Brent has been very much involved in our No to CANSEC, No War 2020, now No War 2021 planning. So welcome, Brent.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be able to join you, and thank you, Greta, for that introduction, and Tara for your words. And likewise, I also really enjoyed the first panel. Wanting to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Wanting to highlight that and note that. And I'll try and keep my comment short, because I think in terms of what I'd like to present, it's really about trying to set a context, some guidance, as it were, for a fuller movement discussion about how we move forward. And so and I'm glad to be able to have the chance to talk about how we move from weapons to windmills, from an economy that manufactures for war, an economy that manufactures wars, that in many ways is literally at war with the earth, and how we move away from that towards an economy based on peace. So the different areas, I guess, that I'd like to touch upon are, or how I'd like to approach that, is to look at the political moment, the moment that we're in right now, which is unfortunately very much informed by the COVID-19 pandemic. What does that mean? The economic challenges that the pandemic has generated for militarism and military spending. If we're looking at how we move from weapons or warheads to windmills, and climate justice, what can we learn from the climate justice movement that does so much work in terms of stopping destructive extractive projects and working to stop pipelines, and how do we apply that to the peace movement? So I'll have some numbers, and if you don't necessarily catch them, so this is being recorded, but I've also posted basically the notes for this presentation on the Peace Brigades International Canada website. So you can have a look at that if you want to maybe see a fuller version of this. So looking at the political moment, I mean, the first thing I think we have to acknowledge is the awful human toll that is related to this pandemic. More than 350,000 people around the world have died. More than 6,700 people have died in Canada. That's almost 10 times the number of people soldiers who have died in wars that Canada has been engaged in the post-World War II timeframe. In the city where I live, in Ottawa, as of yesterday, there were 238 people who had died. That's more people than died, Canadians, more people died than Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan, and more than 9 years of the Canadian military being there. What it also means beyond that terrible, terrible human toll is massive public expenditures. And some of what I'll be talking about focuses a bit on more on Canada, but it likely also applies to the United Kingdom or the United States or New Zealand or other countries. So in terms of the pandemic hitting this country, it's meant millions of people have lost their jobs, and massive public spending in terms of relief, income support, efforts to spur the economy in different ways. And what it means is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which is like a budget oversight office in Canada, is anticipating a federal deficit of close to $113 billion. And that's significant in part because that's almost $90 billion more than was originally forecast. So it's a massive public expenditure that's been required. And generally what that means is when we are through this, hopefully through this pandemic, that there's government bills to be paid. And what we've seen historically is there's often attack on social programs and public services that we have to be prepared for. But it could also mean, it also creates the conditions where there'll be a pressure not to be spending as much money on war, militarism, on military hardware. And so Tamara referenced it in terms of the ships, in terms of the $19 billion plus allocated for fighter jets. And again, also the report that Tamara was noting has said basically there's something like $553 billion set aside for the Canadian military over the next 20 years. And so now, apart from being able to argue that's morally wrong or that's wasteful expenditures, we can now argue additionally, because of the pandemic, because of the expenditures and the deficit around the pandemic, that we can't afford. We can't afford that spending anymore. And I think also in the political moment that we'll want to keep in mind too that we can expect a pushback. We can expect a pushback from those who want that arms spending continue, who want to see the global economy continuing to head in the direction of destructive, extractive, fossil fuel intensive production. So we can expect that pushback. And in part, we know that because during this pandemic, the war industry in Canada and other countries has been defined or determined as an essential service, and so that production has continued. We've definitely seen in Canada where environmental protections have been removed or weakened, particularly in the tar sands where they were already weak. So we see that pushback already, and maybe we can anticipate too the various lobby groups arguing in terms of now more than ever the fossil fuel industry and the arms industry are vital for security and they're vital for recovery. So we need to be keeping that in mind in terms of our work. I think too, in terms of the political moment, we can think about shifting attitudes, shifting public attitudes and how we work with that. So in Canada, what we've seen is more than 80% of the people who have died in this country from the virus, from the COVID-19 virus, have died in long-term care homes, homes for elderly people in this country, homes that have seen consistent public funding cutbacks over the years. They're underfunded, and homes that about 40% of the system has been privatized, meaning big profits for those who own these homes, and poor service for those who to live in them. So I think that's all the more evident in this country right now. We're seeing it, ironically enough, because the military have had to go into some of these homes, and they've reported on the dismal conditions. So I think we can perhaps sense that there'll be a political movement to spend on healthcare and on the elderly, and not so much on the military. And maybe this is also evident in terms of a shifting attitude, in terms of, and maybe we saw this more in the United States, but in terms of people really looking aghast, as it were, at these military flyovers, whether it's the Royal Canadian Air Force or the Thunderbirds or Blue Angels in the United States, these flyovers to salute frontline healthcare workers who are wanting basic supplies, health protection supplies. Well, you know, it can cost $60,000 or more to fly these jets for these so-called salutes. I think also in terms of the political moment, that I think we can talk about, we can express concern about climate change, about climate breakdown in a different way than we've done before. I think people have now collectively experienced this sort of major disruption, this major global crisis, and might be prepared to understand what's currently happening and what's coming, even more in terms of climate breakdown. And so one argument I might just quickly make there is, as I mentioned earlier, sadly, the global death toll for during this pandemic is just over 350,000 people right now. There was a major study a number of years ago that says that's basically the same number of people who die on an annual basis already from the health-related impacts of climate change. And unless there's greater attention or deeper emission reduction cuts, that number will increase to 800,000 people a year dying related to climate change. So I think those are horrific numbers, but those, I think, are some of the things that we need to be bringing up right now. And also too, I mean, I think in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic, this political moment, the UN is saying something like the pandemic means something like an $8.5 trillion loss to the global economy over the next 2 years. And again, I think we can take that figure, that $8.5 trillion loss to the global economy because of the pandemic, to the figures that are being generated around climate breakdown, which says if climate emissions aren't addressed, if climate breakdown isn't addressed, we're looking at a $33 trillion impact to the global economy. So a multiple of like a 4-time multiple of economic disruption. And that's basically the $33 trillion hit to the global economy would be if the planet warms to 2.5 degrees Celsius. That's the configuration. And it's important, I think, to remember, as with the Paris Climate Agreement, that the commitments that have been made by countries for the Paris Climate Agreement, if those were all met, which is in question, but if the commitments that have been made under the Paris Climate Agreement are met, that would take us to a 3.2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So we're talking that there's so much more that needs to be done around climate breakdown, building a green energy economy, and that the military economy that we have now, that the war production economy right now is the complete opposite direction that we need to go. So I had more to say, but I'm going to keep it just to this, and maybe just a few quick conclusions, and because I'm eager to hear Simon, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts as well in terms of how we navigate these questions as a movement. So just, I mean, quickly to conclude that it's possible, or at least the situation has been created through the pandemic, where there will be new pressures against increases to military spending, against spending money on jet fighters. Fighter jets do nothing to address a pandemic. And because of federal deficit, I'm sure in many countries, they're less and less practical. That to a greater number of people, the people that we are trying to bring into our movement and to mobilize political pressure around, healthcare may seem a lot more vital and a lot more important than warships and warplanes and big armies. So that is, you know, a key argument, I think, for us to be making. That climate breakdown, climate change may seem all the more real, and you may have seen on social media the memes where there's sort of a wave that is the pandemic, and then this major tidal wave overtaking it, that's climate change. And again, another key argument about why we need to move from weapons to windmills, why we need to put our resources towards that. And then lastly, I'll just conclude to say too that we have to be prepared for CADSI, the military lobby group in Canada, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the big oil and gas lobby group in this country. There's equivalents in all countries, that they'll be pushing back against this growing public opinion. And those are just some key areas where we need to work. So I had lots more to say, but I do want to keep it short. So please go to the PBI Canada website. You can see sort of the fuller argumentation, but I'll leave it at that for now. And thank you so much for your time, and I'll look forward to our discussion together.
Thank you so much, Brent. And now I'll welcome our third and last panelist of the evening, Simon Black. Simon is a professor of labor studies at Brock University and the founder of Labor Against the Arms Trade, which is a coalition of peace and labor activists working to end Canada's participation in the international arms trade. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, Greta. Thank you. Just going to share my screen here. Oh, hold on a second. You can see the screen there, Greta, the opening slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm getting used to these new technologies, as we all are. Thank you again to Greta. Thank you to World Beyond War, to Tamara and Brent as well. I'm joining you today from Toronto, the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm a labor studies professor, and I'm a lifelong trade unionist. And as Greta said, I'm also an organizer with Labor Against the Arms Trade. Talk a little bit today about arms conversion and the role of unions, the role of labor, meaning both unions and working class people, workers in general. Labor against the arms trade is really the new kid on the block of the peace movement. So I want to give us or provide a little bit of an introduction to who we are and what we do. As Greta said, we're a coalition of peace and labor activists that were founded to work to end Canada's participation in the international arms trade. We stand for arms conversion. That's our major demand, arms conversion for green, peaceful, socially useful production. We want the government to shift resources from arms to green technologies, including renewable energies, high-speed rail, and so on, to create more and better jobs and a safer world for all. What do we mean by a just transition when we say we demand a just transition for arms industry workers? We're talking about recognition of the need to secure workers' rights and livelihoods when economies are shifting from arms production to production for socially useful ends. I'm going to speak a little bit today about our origins and talk about the relationship between the labor movement, this idea of arms conversion or economic conversion and a just transition in the context of a specific campaign. And that's been the campaign to mobilize labor opposition to Canada's $15 billion arms deal with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about where labor against the arms trade draws inspiration from. 2016 marked the 40th anniversary of the Lucas Plan. Many of you will be familiar with the Lucas Plan, maybe some of you are not, but the Lucas Plan was a plan, an alternative industrial plan that was really developed from the bottom up by, oh, sorry, I'm just having trouble with my slide here. Was developed from the bottom up by workers at Lucas Aerospace in Britain. Lucas Aerospace, most of their orders, most of their production, about 50%, was for military arms for military use, mainly supplying the British Air Force. This plan was a plan that came about in the context of cuts to thousands of jobs, industrial restructuring, technological change, and international competition, which was going to lead to unemployment, mass unemployment amongst workers at Lucas Aerospace. And the plan was to bring together the various unions and various workers, those unions represented at Lucas Aerospace, to come up with an alternative plan for the future of the company, a plan to retain jobs by proposing alternative socially useful applications of the company's technology, but also of the workers' skills. And the workers did this under the banner of No to Arms Production. We want socially useful work. So this alternative plan was to develop a future for the company in which Lucas Aerospace would move from arms production to socially useful production. And the plan showed ultimately that disarmament did not have to mean thousands of workers losing their jobs, that arms conversion did not have to mean thousands of workers losing their jobs. So shop stewards across unions representing Lucas Aerospace workers coordinated the process in which workers and also the local community came up with ideas and technologies and markets and new products. And they developed what was an extensive 50-page corporate plan. It was about 5 detailed technical sections, each about 200 pages in length, in addition to that main 50-page corporate plan. And the objective of the plan was twofold. It was to protect union members' right to work in the context of recessions and layoffs and offshoring of work. And it was to ensure that among the alternative products produced, that they would be useful to the community at large, that they would have social use. This plan, this alternative plan, came up with about 150 alternative products that Lucas Aerospace technology and workers put together could produce, including, and this is why Lucas Aerospace workers have been called eco-pioneers, including green technologies like wind turbines. So these workers in 1976 were way ahead of their time when thinking and planning for conversion for green, peaceful production, a green, peaceful economy. The Financial Times, which is no friend of either the peace movement or the labor movement, called the plan one of the most radical alternative plans ever drawn up by workers for their company. Now, ultimately, for a variety of reasons, the plan was never adopted by Lucas Aerospace. And maybe in the question and answer, we can get as to why. And that's one of really the challenges when we talk about arms conversion. Why such an extensive plan? And Tamara also touched on the plan that the Canadian Auto Workers Union, now Unifor, developed in the context of Irving shipyards in Nova Scotia, why the plan was not adopted. So this is our inspiration, the Lucas plan and alternative plans like it. We were founded as an organization that would really try to make inroads with the labor movement in terms of opposing Canada's participation in the international arms trade, but more specifically, we were founded in opposition to the Canada-Saudi arms deal. I want to talk a little bit about that arms deal to give some broader context to our work. That arms deal was signed in 2014 by our previous federal government, a conservative government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. The deal's been upheld by the darling of the liberal world, Justin Trudeau, and the Liberal government. So arms export permits, the permits that are necessary for arms manufacturers to export their arms abroad and to Saudi Arabia specifically, have been upheld and renewed by the Trudeau government. This deal, which is worth $15 billion, involves the production of light armored vehicles and their export to Saudi Arabia. And it is the largest, as far as I know, the largest arms deal in Canadian history. It's also currently the largest arms manufacturing contract that the country has. These light armored vehicles, as you can see depicted on the left side of the slide here, light armored vehicle, a LAV, as I'll refer to them, are made by General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, which is a subsidiary of the of General Dynamics in the United States. Estimates say they support the contract. This deal supports about 3,000 jobs in London, Ontario, where GDLS Canada is located. And that's not just jobs at the plant, but it's also jobs through suppliers and the kind of knock-on effects that a big contract like that has in a community like London. Saudi was Canada's largest non-US destination for military exports in 2018. And we know from our research from the great work of human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations that, these arms, these LAVs are being deployed in the Saudi intervention or war in Yemen, which has led to, according to the United Nations, the world's most severe or biggest humanitarian crisis. Millions food insecure, millions displaced. Over 100,000 people have now lost their life as a result of the blockade of Yemen's ports by the Saudi-led military coalition, which is backed to the hilt by the West. Often mentioned in the press in terms of coverage of this war of the United States and France and Britain, but Canada as well, as we see with this arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Yemen and workers' rights. It's not only that these LAVs are being deployed in neighboring Yemen. For the labor movement, this should be a concern because the Saudi arms deal involves the sale of LAVs to Saudi Arabia, which is consistently one of the top 10 worst countries in the world for workers' rights. Where Labor Against the Arms Trade took our more immediate inspiration from was the fact that we saw, starting in 2018, a number of instances of dock workers taking action against the export of arms to Saudi Arabia. In Canada, in 2018, in December, peace activists assembled at the port of St. John in New Brunswick. And the workers there at the Port of St. John, the dock workers, are represented by the International Longshoremen's Association Local 273, which actually has a proud tradition of internationalism and solidarity. Dock workers there in the 1970s refused to export or refused to handle and load nuclear components that were destined for the military junta in Argentina. And in 2003, ILA 273 declared any arms destined for Iraq or the war in Iraq to be hot cargo and refused to load them. So this is a port that has a proud tradition of radical labor solidarity and internationalism. And what happened in December of 2018 is the peace activists that were assembled at the Port of St. John were there to stop the offloading of light armored vehicles destined for Saudi Arabia from the rail lines that brought them there, the rail cars that brought them there from London, Ontario, where they're manufactured, and onto the ships that were in port at Port of St. John, which were owned and operated by the Saudi national shipping company, Bahari. What those protesters were able to do was stop the loading of those lavs for 1 day, to delay the loading of those lavs for 1 day. And what that led to was, and the reason they were able to stop the loading of those lavs is because the workers there respected the picket line, the peace picket that was established outside of the port. So the leadership of the ILA said they would refuse to cross the peace picket, which was set up outside the gates of the port. And although both the workers in respecting the peace picket and the peace activists in establishing it prevented the lavs from being loaded for 1 day, they were eventually loaded the next day or the following day after that, and then they were shipped again off to Saudi Arabia. Now, what happened to that union for taking that stand was that the International Longshoremen's Association was taken before the Canada Labour Board and is now facing very steep, heavy fines that are being levied by the Labour Board for taking part in what's essentially a political strike or an illegal strike under Canadian labor law. Unfortunately, the rest of the Canadian labor movement did not really come to the aid of the Longshoremen's Association Local 273. So in some ways, we could say that local, by taking a brave stand for internationalism and against militarism, was kind of left hanging out to dry by the rest of the labor movement. But what we saw in the months that proceeded was a number of dock worker unions across Europe, including in the port of Genoa, the port of Le Havre, the port of Bilbao in Spain's Basque Country, where the shipping line Bahari was making regular visits to load arms and explosives from Spain. We saw a number of dock workers unions working with peace activists to declare goods, arms destined for Saudi Arabia as hot cargo and refusing to load them onto ships, onto the Bahari Yambu, which is pictured here on the right hand of your screen on the slide. So we saw an upsurge really in dock worker activism and dock worker international solidarity. We were formed really to mobilize labor opposition to the Saudi arms deal in the context of the failure of the labor movement to step up and support the International Longshoremen's Association Local 273. And in June 2019, a number of us, including over 250 academics, labor activists, peace activists, and trade unions, including the Canadian Union for Public Employees, Ontario, the British Columbia General Employees Union, the largest public sector union in those two provinces respectively. A number of New Democratic Party, our Social Democratic Party in Canada MPs and provincial members of provincial parliament signed on a letter to the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. The Canadian Labour Congress, for Americans who are tuned in, is our equivalent of the AFL-CIO. It's their National Labour Federation. And what that letter asked or demanded of the Canadian Labour Congress was that in solidarity with the people of Yemen, in solidarity with workers in Saudi Arabia, that the CLC take a public stand against the Saudi arms deal. And not only that, that they mobilize their considerable resources to coordinate labor opposition to the arms deal, and also to use their power in terms of coordinating labor opposition to declare arms destined for Saudi Arabia, including light armored vehicles, to be hot cargo. That is, that trade unionists would refuse to handle that cargo, refuse to handle those arms, whether loading onto rail or onto ships. While that campaign is ongoing and we've yet to successfully get the CLC to commit to opposing the Saudi arms deal, what we found in organizing the campaign, as you see from this slide here, is that trade unionists, that unions are central, the unionized workers are central to the supply chain for light armored vehicles that are being exported from Canada to Saudi Arabia. You see in the top right of your screen there, the turrets that are affixed onto the LAVs when they're assembled in London, Ontario, are turrets that are produced by CMI, a company that's US based, but also operates in Belgium. They're imported into the Port of Montreal. If you follow the next arrow over to the left, at the Port of Montreal is a port that has workers there represented by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So it's a unionized port. From the Port of Montreal, those turrets are taken by rail, by workers, rail workers who are represented by both the Teamsters and Unifor, which is the largest private sector union in Canada. And those turrets are then taken to London, Ontario, to General Dynamics Land Systems, where the workers at that plant, where the LAVs are manufactured and assembled, are represented again by Unifor. From London, Ontario, if you follow the next arrow over, the LAVs are transported by rail, or they have been transported by rail, by Teamsters and Unifor members to the Port of St. John in New Brunswick. Again, as I mentioned before, in the instance of that peace picket in 2018, the dock workers there are represented by the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA, where they're then exported and picked up by the Bahari Shipping Company of Saudi Arabia. As of 2020, we're able to surmise through some of our research that the LAVs are no longer being shipped out of that unionized port, the ILO Port of St. John, but are now being shipped to or through the Port of Baltimore, which is also, the workers there are also represented by the International Longshoremen's Association, where they're then exported, or sometimes not directly exported to Saudi Arabia. They're often making stops in ports like Genoa in Italy and Le Havre. So what we see from this diagram here is that all of the various points, the keynodes, or what we can call choke points for the LAV supply chain involves unionized workers from the point of production to the point of import to the point of export by rail and by ship. What this tells us is that despite many efforts in terms of both human rights and humanitarian organizations' efforts to end Canada's arms deal with Saudi Arabia, what this tells us is that unionized workers at any point in the supply chain, if they took action, could essentially do what these organizations have so far been unable to do, and that is to end this arms deal, or at least stop it in its tracks. Now, what are the challenges for a campaign like this and for thinking more broadly about arms conversion? Well, that plant in London, Ontario, as I mentioned, supports about 3,000 workers, both directly and indirectly, the GDLS plant in London, where the labs are manufactured and assembled. The labor movement has been in retreat for about 40 years, this period we call neoliberalism. And they are fighting defensive battles, holding on to past gains. In order to encourage unions to take the type of action that we would like them as a peace movement to take, such as the type of action we saw by the ILA 273 in the Port of St. John, is going to require a change within the movement itself. It's going to require deep organizing, and it's going to require the peace movement working with those trade unionists who want to see a more peaceful, green world, a more socially just world, and feel that their unions are not fighting for that world that they want to bring and we want to bring into existence. We must, in the peace movement, recognize that workers are increasingly precarious. Those, to go back to the example, the case study of the labs that are produced in London, Ontario at GDLS, those workers have what are probably the best jobs in all of London, Ontario, in the greater London area. 50% of Canadian workers, the Canadian workforce, experiences some degree of precariousness in their work. So when you have arms manufacturing industries like GDLS, which are rooted in a community like London, and they're providing good jobs, good wages, unionized with benefits, we have to recognize that those workers are really the envy of many other workers in a place like London, Ontario, which has experienced deindustrialization and the rise of kind of low-wage service sector work, replacing good unionized manufacturing jobs. When we talk about arms conversion, we are confronting this idea of the market shall rule. When we're talking about planning and production for social need and not for profit, we are coming up against the very logic that our capitalist economy is built around. We in the labor movement, and more specifically in labor against the arms trade, note that if we're going to talk about arms conversion for socially useful production, then we need to also talk about the state, and we need to talk about economic planning, and we need to talk about bringing arms industries and arms manufacturers into public ownership and into government ownership. So nationalization, essentially, if we're going to talk about the production for social need and not for profit. Now, those are many challenges, but as Brent and Tamara both laid out, there are a number of opportunities that are particular context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as devastating as it's been for so many people and lives lost. There are opportunities for arms conversion and for the argument to be made. One opportunity is that we're seeing a number of arms manufacturers, Babcock in the UK, the General Dynamics in the US, make very first tentative, not very wide-ranging commitments, but commitments to manufacturing PPE, to personal protective equipment, and also hospital ventilators, which are in a desperate need right now. What this tells us is that years and years of these companies and governments telling us that arms conversion is going to have to be a slow and steady process, or it's not possible, that's really bullshit. That if push comes to shove, these companies, these manufacturers can be moved, can be retooled to produce socially useful products, such as hospital ventilators. Austerity is, as Brent mentioned, is increasingly unpopular in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the deficits that governments are having to run to deal with the economic crisis and the health crisis. But I don't think popular opinion is going to be on the side of those who are saying that we need to cut government spending, that we have an opportunity here to make an argument for a green, caring economy, which must include the conversion of arms industries. As also Brent mentioned, we are living through a climate crisis and we are seeing shifting public opinion. the idea or this paradigm of a Green New Deal offers opportunities for us to think about arms conversion for green production. And the biggest opportunity we have is that if you were to go down to that GD-less plant in London and stand outside the factory gates and speak to workers and give workers a choice, say you can either continue manufacturing these light armor vehicles that are destined for Saudi Arabia and then deployed in Yemen, creating death and destruction, or you can have the same wage, the same benefits, the same sorts of security, producing wind turbines, producing green technologies, producing renewables or high-speed rail. The majority of workers are going to say yes to that. So we have that as an opportunity. We have that on our side, that the majority of workers, arms industry workers, would rather be producing something else. They'd rather be producing wind turbines, for example. We need to think about our coalition building when it comes to bringing the peace, the green movement, the environmental movement, the workers' movement together to push for arms conversion. We need to have, in all our activism, the demand for arms conversion at the center of all of our advocacy and all of our campaigns. The recognition that all workers have a right to decent work. This is the only way we're going to get one of the most powerful social movements that exists in the world, that is the labor movement, the trade union movement, on board with the demand to demilitarize and decarbonize. We have to recognize that workers are facing precarity, but we also have to recognize that that unionization of arms industries is a positive. If we can sit down with workers in a unionized plant, we can sit down with workers in a unionized plant or make contacts with a union who represent workers in an arms manufacturing plant. Without a union there, we do not have a point of entry to speak to workers. We don't have an organization in the union that, at least nominally, has a commitment to social justice, a commitment to peace, a commitment to international human rights. So a unionized arms manufacturing industry is better than a non-union one. If there's no unions present, then there's no chance, there's no opportunity for us to actually speak and develop in collaboration, in cooperation with unions, any plan for conversion, whether it be one plant or a general economy more broadly. We need to be principled in our politics. We need to take the stands that we have to take when it comes to pushing for peace. But we also have to build with understanding. We have to recognize the contradictions and limitations that unionized workers face in their daily lives and that labor movement more broadly faces. We are working, by way of conclusion, Labor Against the Arms Trade is working with a number of organizations, including Amnesty International, Oxfam Canada, and WILP, the Women International's League for Peace and Freedom. We are working towards a national day of action against the Saudi arms deal, which centers this demand for arms conversion. And that day of action is going to take place on June 11th, probably start around noontime. But if you're interested in being involved, if you have the chance or the ability and capacity to promote this amongst your members, or if you're a member of an organization and you think people would like to come down to either London, Ontario, or cities across Canada, which will be holding local protests as part of this National Day of Action, or if you would like to participate in the online component of the Day of Action, then please do stay in touch and get in contact with Labor Against the Arms Trade. We're on Twitter at LAAT Canada, or you can reach me at my Brock University email address or the Labor Against the Arms Trade address at gmail.com. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Simon, and everyone for sharing all of this amazing information. I do want to recognize that we are out of time at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we will stay on to answer the questions, and we have a list of questions that people have been sending in over the past 3 hours. So if you can stay on and listen to the discussion, please do. If you have to hop off, that's okay. We will send the link to this recording afterwards. So I'm just going to jump right into some of the questions that we have here. So one question, I think, Brent, you could possibly answer this one, although other panelists might want to chime in as well. But this first question is, how can we work better with the environmental movement? And specifically, someone mentioned Extinction Rebellion, and I know, Brent, you identify with Extinction Rebellion as well. So maybe you can talk about how you got involved with that and kind of made those cross connections between the peace and environmental movement.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's come through in all the presentations today, and the importance of seeing these struggles as intersectional. That when we talk about building a peace economy or building a revitalizing the peace movement, that means connecting with the climate justice movement. That means connecting with those challenging the militarization of borders. It means supporting the unionized labor and building that economy. It means recognizing human rights as a part of it. It's really just looking at all of the different struggles and seeing those interconnections. Maybe just two quick things I'll say. I mean, one, it's come through really very well, particularly in the first panel about the importance of nonviolent civil disobedience, about direct action. That was key in the first panel. That's really sort of a key part of what Extinction Rebellion and other climate justice movements have indicated, and part of that critique of NGOs, if I can put it that way, has been that, the polite symbolic protest, e-petitions are important, but they can't be everything. We really do need to be out on the streets. Yeah, maybe just lastly too, I want to say in terms of the importance of intersectionality, and a number of speakers highlighted, Colin was really, I know if he had more time, would have really spoken in terms of the key aspects of Indigenous rights and supporting Indigenous land defenders. One of the points I just want to get in here is in this discussion about moving from weapons to windmills. Even in terms of windmills, we need to be thinking about intersectionality. I know Peace Brigades International in Mexico accompanies a number of communities, a number of Indigenous communities, where these massive transnational wind farms are put onto Indigenous territories without free, prior, and informed consent. And it means a lot of violence and repression against Indigenous peoples, against land defenders, a violation of their rights. And so even when we think it's sort of green and good, we really have to be thinking about all of the layers behind it as well.
Thank you, Brent. And before we continue, I want to give a quick plug for tomorrow's session, because this isn't the end of our No War 2020 conference. So if you do have to hop off, I hope you can all join us tomorrow, Saturday, May 30th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We're doing an open mic session with live music from the Ottawa Raging Grannies, as well as from Sandy Greenberg, and we'll hear from World Beyond War chapter coordinators around the world. And it will also be a time for you all, the participants, to share stories of your activism, poetry, music, whatever you want to share during this open mic. So that's tomorrow from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can log in using the same Zoom link. And now we'll continue for 10 more minutes with the Q&A. So I want to ask a question here for Simon. Simon, can you talk a little bit more about the Lucas Plan and specifically what stopped it or why it didn't come into fruition?
Yeah, I'm not a historian of the Lucas Plan, but what I know is that there was both a change of government in the UK. So the Lucas Plan was first conceived, and Tamara may know more about this, under a Labour government. So there was at least some sympathy to what the workers and what the unions were doing at Lucas Aerospace when the Conservative government was elected a few years after. There was, of course, very little sympathy for the workers. And then when the Thatcher government was elected, you know, she did her best, and her government did her best to break the labor movement, break the unions in the UK. But what the Lucas plan also got at was the idea of the idea really at the heart of capitalist economies was the idea of private property, and that a small number of people, capitalists, make the decisions about the who, what, where of production. And the Lucas plan pushed back against that very logic, which is at the heart of the economic system. Unfortunately, the plan also received lukewarm support from the rest of the labor movement in the UK, although there are many rank and file activists who were supportive of the alternative plan that were developed from the bottom up by those workers. So it's a bit of a complicated history, but there's plenty of good articles on it online because we've had that 40th anniversary. So you can always Google to check out those articles. There's some that are in Red Pepper magazine and The Guardian and others.
Thank you, Simon. A question for Tamara. How can we get Canada out of NATO? I know you've been doing a lot on this topic.
Yeah, one of the important reasons for us to get out of NATO and to abolish NATO is that NATO puts intense pressure on its member countries to increase military spending and to buy new military equipment, to constantly modernize the militaries to remain interoperable. And so, you know, NATO is pushing Canada to increase military spending and to buy the new fighter jets and to build new warships, because, you know, this helps NATO project its power and engage in military interventions. So I and the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace were very much opposed to NATO. We have a campaign, Feminists Against Militarism, Women Say No to NATO. We've been protesting outside the NATO Association of Canada office every month for the past year and a half. We started last January 2019, time to NATO's 70th anniversary. I'm encouraging all of you to speak out and to raise awareness about NATO. NATO is it's militarizing our countries. It's militarizing the planet. It's preventing us from investing in a Green New Deal and to shift to a great green transformation. So NATO has got to be part of our work. Abolishing NATO has got to be part of our work. And just to let you know that I'm also part of the No to NATO International Network. You're welcome to join it. And please send me an email. I'm happy to share information. We have some graphics. We have some handouts that we're happy to share with you. And let's talk more about No to NATO in June 2021 in Ottawa, because I would like to have a little meeting about abolishing NATO and Canada out of NATO. So be sure to come next year to Canada. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. And we'll send the email for Tamara so you can get in contact with her when we send the email to all of the registrants afterwards. So the next question, and any of the panelists, even the former panelists from the other panel could answer this. How can we promote nonviolent conflict resolution to our politicians as well as to the public at large, for example, like unarmed peacekeeping?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in to say, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. That's a very good question. And a lot of it really, I think, is around, I mean, broadly in terms of building a base around peace education and building awareness around alternatives to war. Many of you are involved in that work already. Certainly World Beyond War is in many ways leading that kind of work. So I think it's about creating an analysis that supports peace, education that supports peace, alternatives, peaceful alternatives, and really looking at building broader movements that understand that and see that and prioritize that. And I think if we can be intersectional amongst you know, a range of different movements, we can build that important base, that important momentum. And then, I mean, that's sort of the opportunity when we can really approach or challenge politicians or a power structure around that. I think it's through popular pressure, through a building of a popular movement, an intersectional popular movement, that we can do that, all the while supporting everything that many of you are engaged in and have been for years.
Thanks, Brent. Specific question for Simon that came in. How many Canadian unionized workers are represented in that transportation production map that you showed us?
I actually don't know. That's research we'd have to do. So I'm not able to say. We just know the number of unions representing workers along that logistics chain and at the manufacturing plant.
Okay, the next question is about protesting during this COVID crisis time. There's a question any of you could answer about your experiences. Have any of you participated in protests using social distancing, you know, getting out there but still maintaining distance, or finding other sort of creative ways to still get out in the public sphere even during this crisis time?
I'll just say quickly that I've taped little videos and I've posted on social media. I've taken pictures of myself outside with my signs. I've written chalk on my sidewalk against the fighter jets and the warships. So, and I've written letters and just tried to raise awareness on social media. It's also a good time to try to do some like research and some writing as well. And I have to try to update my demilitarize.ca website. And I know we're running out of time, but I just want to make a quick plug too, to encourage Canadians on the call to join us on Sunday, May 31st from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern time to help revitalize the Canadian peace movement. Because if we want to pursue this conversion from our war economy in Canada to a peace economy, it's going to require a strong movement, and we need all of you to participate. So you can contact Greta or I, and we can give you more details about this call on Sunday. Thanks.
Can I say something, Greta?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just in relation to the first question, I mean, it's one piece in a complex thing, but how do you engage nonviolently? An important, but not the only element is training. And anybody who really wants to get engaged with it, it seems to me has to kind of, in effect, do it with guidance. And that takes some training. And I just would encourage people to think about that and where the training is available. I mean, you've got Nonviolence Peace Force, you've got Priest Brigades International, you've got a range of groups that are engaged in training, and it's really worth it, I think, to explore what it actually means on the ground. I mean, I haven't been arrested very often, but my first arrest took place during training. It was a real learning experience, actually. And in fact, it wasn't even in Canada, it was in Minneapolis, which is another story, but just a note.
Thanks, Colin. The last question is, how can we intervene to stand in solidarity with workers if we, don't live near a manufacturing plant? What are some ways that we can still support the workers and promote this transition that we've been talking about?
I think that's a great question. I'd encourage anybody to reach out to us and to join us in Labor Against the Arms Trade. We need to start thinking about how we can plan to intervene at labor conventions, at the Canadian Labour Congress Convention. We need to think and strategize around particular unions, especially unions that represent a great number of workers in arms industry. So there's a lot to do, there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot to strategize. You don't have to be near an arms manufacturing plant to take action and build the type of solidarity and bridges with the labor movement that we need to make arms conversion a reality.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you to all the presenters and participants. We will conclude with that and hope to see you tomorrow on Saturday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time for our open mic session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.